"Get out of my house," my father roared, throwing my suitcase onto the wet grass of our front lawn. The rain was pouring down in sheets, but I did not flinch. I looked him dead in the eye and quietly asked if he was absolutely sure he wanted to do this. He laughed in my face. He told me I was a worthless parasite. What he did not know was that the little tech company he constantly mocked was paying me $50 million a year. The next morning, a fleet of black corporate vehicles would stop in front of his failing logistics firm, and my father would finally understand exactly who he had just thrown away. But by then, it would be far too late to beg. My name is Harper. I am 31 years old. In the grand hierarchy of my family, I was always the rebellious disappointment. My father, Richard, owned a legacy freight and logistics company in Chicago. To him, real work meant diesel fuel warehouses and sweat, because I spent my teenage years and my 20s quietly coding and building software. He told everyone I just played on computers all day. I let him believe it. I let them all believe it. It was easier to be invisible than to fight for the approval of a man who measured love by how much you could stroke his massive ego. The cold October rain soaked through my jacket as I stood on his perfectly manicured lawn. Neighbors were peeking through their blinds, watching the great Richard throw his ultimate temper tantrum. My suitcase lay in the mud, bursting open, my clothes getting completely ruined. He stood on the porch under the warm glow of the entryway light, his face red with a terrifying mix of desperation and pure rage. He actually thought he was winning. He thought he was cutting off a financial burden, a useless daughter who refused to sacrifice her silly little hobby to save his sinking empire. He was completely bankrupt, drowning in debt he had kept hidden from the world, and he wanted me to sign away my business as collateral for a bank loan. When I said no, he dragged me by the arm to the front door and tossed my belongings into the storm. I stood there shivering, not from the cold, but from the sudden crystal-clear realization of what my family truly was. I did not cry. I had cried enough over the years for a father who only saw me as a tool to be used or discarded. I simply picked up my ruined bag, turned my back on the house I grew up in, and walked toward my modest rental car parked at the curb. I made sure to walk slowly so he could not see the black security SUV idling 3 blocks away, waiting to escort me back to my real life. 2 hours before the rain soaked through my clothes on the front lawn, I was sitting at the massive mahogany dining table in my childhood home in Chicago. The air in the room was thick and suffocating under the weight of my father's manufactured authority. Richard did not ask for meetings. He summoned people. He had summoned me here tonight under the guise of a rare family dinner. But the stack of legal documents resting next to his untouched plate of steak told a very different story. For as long as I can remember, my father measured a person's worth by the weight of the dirt on their boots and the size of the engines they commanded. He inherited a Midwestern freight and logistics company from my grandfather and spent the next 3 decades acting like he was a titan of industry. He loved the smell of diesel. He loved walking through his warehouses barking orders. But the world had moved on. Supply chains digitized. Logistics became about algorithms, not just brute force. His company was bleeding money, suffocating under outdated systems, and his own arrogant refusal to adapt. Of course, nobody was allowed to say that out loud. In this house, Richard was a king, and his failures were always someone else's fault. Sitting across from him was my younger sister, Jessica, who was casually swirling a glass of expensive red wine. She was the undeniable golden child, the one who did everything right by my parents' standards. Next to her sat her husband, Marcus. Marcus was a highly successful corporate attorney at a downtown firm, a sharp, impeccably dressed African-American man who commanded respect in courtrooms and completely dominated our family gatherings. My father absolutely adored Marcus. Marcus provided the legal muscle for my father's business and fed his ego perfectly. To them, I was just Harper. I was the weird, quiet daughter who moved away, stared at screens all day, and played with code instead of getting a real job. My father cleared his throat and tapped his heavy gold watch against the polished wood table. He did not look at me with the warmth of a parent welcoming their child home. He looked at me like a landlord inspecting a leaky pipe. He picked up the thick stack of legal documents and slid them roughly across the table. The heavy paper stopped right in front of my hands. He told me he needed me to sign these tonight. his voice carrying that booming, absolute tone he used on his truck drivers. I looked down at the documents. The bold print at the top read, "Liability transfer and collateral assignment." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I looked up and quietly asked him what this was. Marcus answered before my father could even open his mouth. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his silk tie with a deeply patronizing smile. He told me it was a simple collateral agreement. He explained that my father was securing a bridge loan to expand the freight fleet and that the bank needed a secondary guarantor with clean credit to push the underwriting through. Marcus then casually mentioned they were rolling my little app company in as a collateral asset, claiming it was just a formality. I stared at Marcus, and then I looked at my father. I asked him if he really wanted me to sign over my business to secure a loan for his company. Jessica scoffed, rolling her eyes and checking her perfectly manicured nails. She told me not to make it sound so dramatic. She said Dad was just trying to save the family legacy and that the least I could do was help out with my little computer hobby. My father leaned forward, placing his heavy hands flat on the table. He told me to listen to him. He said the freight business was real work, that it was tangible, and put food on tables. He looked me right in the eye and said the little startup thing I had been playing around with for the last decade was not a real career. He claimed he was giving me a chance to actually contribute to this family. He promised that if I signed those papers, the bank would see a secondary asset, the loan would clear, and his company would keep running. I looked down at the signature lines. I saw Marcus had stamped his name as the primary legal counsel handling the transfer. The math simply did not make sense. A massive legacy company does not need a tiny startup to secure a standard fleet expansion loan unless the primary company is completely underwater. My father was not expanding. He was drowning. And Marcus had drafted a contract that would legally bind my personal assets to my father's sinking ship. They thought my company was worthless, yet they were desperate enough to use it as a life raft. I looked up and said no. The word dropped into the dining room like a brick. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. My father growled, asking me to excuse myself, as his face instantly turned a deep shade of crimson. I kept my voice completely level. I told him I was not signing these documents. I said I was not putting my company up as collateral for his freight business, because my business belongs to me. Marcus let out a short, condescending laugh. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, speaking to me in the slow, exaggerated tone one might use with a stubborn toddler. He told me to be realistic. He said I ran a tiny software project and did not understand corporate finance or mezzanine debt. He praised my father's legacy logistics empire. Then Marcus looked at me with pure arrogance and said that when a family faces a cash flow bottleneck, family requires sacrifice. He told me that is how dynasties survive. He finished by saying I could not possibly be so selfish that I would let my father's life work struggle just to protect a computer game. I stared directly into his dark, calculating eyes and told him it was not a game, and it was certainly not available for him to leverage. My father slammed his fist onto the mahogany table so hard the wine glasses rattled violently. He roared at me, calling me an ungrateful parasite, while the veins bulged in his neck. He yelled that he had put a roof over my head and fed me. He said he had to watch me waste my life staring at screens while my sister actually made something of herself. He praised Jessica for marrying a partner at a law firm and building a life, then asked me what I had built. He told me I contribute nothing. I looked over at Jessica. She was casually sipping her wine, watching the spectacle with a smug, satisfied smirk. She absolutely loved this. She loved watching me be reduced to nothing in our father's eyes. My father pointed a shaking finger at the documents and demanded I pick up the pen and sign my name. He shouted that if I did not sign those papers right then and there, I was no longer a part of this family and I would be dead to him. He fully expected me to break. He thought the threat of losing his conditional toxic love would force me to surrender. He honestly believed he was intimidating a struggling, naive girl who desperately needed his validation. He did not know that the little computer hobby he was screaming about was currently revolutionizing global supply chain routing. He did not know that I owned 100% of a proprietary artificial intelligence firm that completely dwarfed his entire net worth. And he certainly had no idea that my personal legal team had already warned me about Marcus and his shady corporate filings. I stood up slowly, leaving the pen exactly where it was. I looked at the angry, desperate man who had never once bothered to ask what my company actually did. I told him I was not signing anything, my voice eerily calm against his raging temper. I told him I thought it was best if I left. The sheer silence that followed my words was heavy and pregnant with the realization that I was actually defying him. Then the anger took over completely, setting the stage for the rain-soaked exile that would permanently alter all of our lives. The moment the word no left my lips, the atmosphere in the dining room shattered completely. My father erupted like a volatile force of nature. The mahogany chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor as he shot to his feet. He towered over the table, his chest heaving rapidly, his face a terrifying mask of deep purple rage. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face and unleashed a relentless torrent of pure vitriol. He called me a selfish, worthless parasite. He screamed that while he had spent 30 long years breaking his back to build a real family legacy, a tangible empire of steel and sweat, I had done absolutely nothing but hide behind a computer screen, playing meaningless games. He paced frantically behind his chair, shouting that I had milked his resources, eaten his food, and lived under his roof for decades, only to turn my back on him the very second the family actually needed my help. Every single word he spat across the dining room was meticulously designed to make me feel incredibly small, to remind me that in his eyes, my entire life amounted to a useless hobby, while Jessica and Marcus were the true shining pillars of the household. He roared that real families bleed for each other, but I was far too obsessed with my pathetic little startup to lift a single finger for the very people who gave me life. Marcus sat back in his chair, crossing his arms over his tailored suit, with a smug, highly satisfied look on his face. He clearly believed my father's aggressive intimidation tactics would break my spirit, just like they always broke everyone else who dared to defy him. Jessica did not even bother to look up from swirling her expensive red wine, perfectly content to sit back and watch my public execution unfold. My father marched aggressively back to the table, grabbed the thick stack of legal documents Marcus had carefully prepared, and slammed them down right in front of me. The loud, sharp smack echoed painfully against the high ceiling. He leaned in so close I could smell the sharp tang of stale whiskey on his heavy breath. His voice dropped from a deafening roar to a menacing, deadly whisper. He told me I had exactly 10 seconds to pick up the pen and sign my name on the dotted line. He issued his final, devastating ultimatum. If I refused to sign my company over to secure his bank loan right now, I was no longer his daughter. I would be completely dead to him, erased from the family tree, and entirely cut off from any future financial support. He looked at me with absolute disgust, eagerly waiting for the familiar submission he demanded from everyone in his orbit. But I felt absolutely nothing. The paralyzing fear he expected to see in my eyes was absent. I calmly told him that I would rather be dead to him than let him steal the only thing I had ever truly built for myself. That quiet response was the absolute breaking point. My father let out a guttural sound that was half scream and half growl. He lunged around the side of the table and grabbed my upper arm with a bruising, crushing grip. He yanked me out of my chair so forcefully that my shoulder joint popped in protest. I did not try to fight back physically. I simply let him drag me, stumbling through the dining room and down the long carpeted hallway, toward the front door. He was panting heavily with uncontrollable rage, muttering under his breath about how ungrateful and pathetic I was. He hauled me roughly into the front foyer, where my small overnight suitcase was sitting quietly by the coat rack. With one violent motion, he shoved me out onto the cold, covered porch, grabbed my suitcase by the top handle, and hurled it out into the dark, pouring rain. The bag hit the wet grass with a heavy thud, tumbling open, spilling my carefully folded clothes straight into the deep mud. The cold October wind whipped freezing rain directly into my face, but I stood my ground on the edge of the wooden porch. I looked at the man who had raised me, the man who was currently red-faced and panting with arrogant pride. I locked my eyes directly onto his and asked him a very simple, quiet question. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" My father let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed harshly through the quiet, suburban neighborhood. He told me he had never been more sure of anything in his miserable life. Then he slammed the heavy oak door right in my face. The brass deadbolt clicked loudly, finalizing my permanent exile. I stood completely alone in the freezing rain for a long moment, listening to the muffled sounds of their self-righteous celebration continuing inside the warm, brightly lit house. They genuinely thought they had just discarded a useless burden. They believed they had taught me a harsh lesson I would never forget. I walked slowly down the porch steps, my shoes sinking deep into the muddy front lawn. I knelt down in the freezing downpour and quietly gathered my ruined, soaking wet clothes, shoving them haphazardly back into the broken suitcase. The soft fabric was completely saturated with dirty, icy water. But I truly did not care. The profound sadness that should have broken my heart was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, highly calculating resolve that coursed through my veins like ice water. I dragged the heavy, muddy bag down the long concrete driveway and began the short walk toward my vehicle. It was a standard, unmarked mid-size sedan, a perfectly modest rental car I had picked up at the airport, specifically to avoid drawing any unnecessary attention to myself during this visit. I unlocked the door, threw the muddy bag into the back seat, and slid behind the steering wheel. I wiped the cold rain from my face and stared back at the glowing windows of my childhood home. They had no idea who they had just thrown away like trash. They had no idea that my personal security detail, operating in a fleet of matte black corporate vehicles, was idling quietly just 3 blocks away, monitoring my exact location. And they certainly had no idea that by kicking me out into the rain tonight, my father had just enthusiastically sealed the total, unavoidable destruction of his own family legacy. The heavy reinforced door of the black Cadillac Escalade closed securely behind me, shutting out the biting October wind and the relentless pouring rain. The luxurious interior of the vehicle was incredibly warm, smelling faintly of rich leather and the subtle ambient cedar scent my private security team always kept running. My lead driver, David, handed me a thick heated towel without saying a single word. He had been working directly with me for over 3 years, and he knew exactly when to speak and when to just let the heavy, comforting silence settle over the spacious cabin. I wrapped the warm towel tightly around my freezing shoulders and let out a long, slow sigh of absolute relief as the massive SUV pulled smoothly away from the dark, wet curb, leaving the illuminated front windows of my childhood home far behind in the rearview mirror. As we glided safely through the dark, quiet suburban streets of Chicago, the intense adrenaline that had kept me standing firmly on that muddy porch finally began to quickly fade away. In its place, a sharp, cold, highly analytical clarity completely took over my mind. My father had just violently discarded me, believing he was successfully trimming dead weight from his precious family legacy. He honestly thought I was just a stubborn, ungrateful girl who played around with meaningless computer code in a dingy rented apartment somewhere in the city. He had absolutely no idea who was actually sitting safely in the back of this heavily armored private car. For the past decade, I had completely hidden my professional life from my family. I did not do it out of malice or spite. I did it because I knew my father would either mock it relentlessly or try to aggressively control it. I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of a highly specialized proprietary artificial intelligence logistics firm. We do not build simple mobile games or basic social media applications. My company engineered the highly complex deep learning algorithms that actively manage the supply chain routing for 3 of the absolute largest e-commerce giants in North America. When millions of commercial packages move seamlessly from sprawling coastal distribution centers to front porches across the country, they are moving entirely on the digital infrastructure that I personally designed and built from scratch. My software instantly predicts severe weather disruptions, calculates optimal diesel fuel loads, and reroutes massive commercial freight fleets in real time to save corporations billions of dollars annually. My father spent his entire life obsessing over physical trucks and diesel engines, completely blind to the fact that the future of his entire industry was being written in code by the very daughter he considered a total failure. He had openly mocked my income at dinner, assuming I was barely scraping by on minimum wage. The undeniable truth was my personal take-home pay after all corporate taxes and internal reinvestments was exactly $50 million a year. I had significantly more liquid capital sitting in my secondary checking accounts than his entire legacy freight company had managed to generate in the last 20 years combined. As the quiet, rhythmic hum of the highway tires grounded my racing thoughts, my highly analytical mind began to replay every single second of that disastrous dinner. Something was fundamentally wrong with how the entire evening had unfolded. My father was undeniably an arrogant, deeply stubborn man, but he was also a proud traditionalist who usually preferred to handle his business affairs quietly and independently. He rarely asked anyone for help, and he certainly never demanded financial collateral from his children to secure a standard commercial bridge loan. His explosive, terrifying reaction on the porch was not just about a bruised ego or his deeply offended pride. That specific level of unhinged explosive rage only comes from one very specific place: absolute, blinding financial desperation. I closed my eyes and pictured the dining room table again, focusing not on my raging father, but strictly on Marcus. My highly successful, incredibly polished African-American brother-in-law was normally the coolest, most calculated man in any corporate room. He thrived on projecting an aura of effortless legal dominance. But tonight, Marcus had been shifting constantly in his heavy mahogany chair. When my father was aggressively screaming across the table, Marcus was gripping the edges of his legal folders so tightly his knuckles had actually turned stark white. And then I clearly remembered the subtle, undeniable sheen of sweat forming on his forehead, just below his perfectly groomed hairline. Marcus had been sweating heavily. He was absolutely terrified. The sudden dark realization hit me with the intense force of a physical blow, making me sit up completely straight in the plush leather seat. The thick stack of legal documents they had tried to violently force me to sign was not a simple collateral assignment to secure a temporary bank loan. A major financial institution does not suddenly require an unrelated tech startup to guarantee a standard fleet expansion. The paperwork Marcus had so meticulously drafted was a complete and total liability transfer. They were not trying to use my company to help secure new operating money. They were desperately trying to legally chain my clean corporate entity and my pristine credit rating to a massive toxic debt they already held. They urgently needed a sacrificial lamb to absorb the devastating financial blow that was clearly about to annihilate their lavish lifestyle. My father did not just want my help to save his business. He and Marcus were actively plotting to legally frame me for the complete and utter collapse of his freight empire, and they were going fully prepared to use my forged signature to save themselves. They had thought I was weak enough to blindly sign away my entire future just to gain their fake approval. But their profound, arrogant underestimation of my financial intelligence and absolute business acumen was about to cost them everything they held dear in this miserable world. I pulled my secure smartphone from the inside pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers moved rapidly across the glowing screen as I dialed the direct emergency number for my lead corporate attorney. Thomas was a brilliant, highly aggressive lawyer who managed the complex legal architecture of my entire $50 million holding company. He answered on the very first ring despite the late hour. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I kept my voice entirely flat and devoid of any traceable emotion as I gave him his strict instructions. I told Thomas to immediately access every single public financial record associated with my father's Midwestern freight and logistics company. I demanded a comprehensive digital sweep of all commercial liens, all active corporate debt structures, every registered mortgage, and any newly recorded mezzanine loans filed under his business entity over the past decade. Thomas did not ask any unnecessary questions. He simply promised to have the fully decrypted files sent to my private server within the hour. I disconnected the call and let the profound silence of the armored vehicle wash over me again. The heavy rain continued to furiously batter the thick, bulletproof glass, but inside the cabin, the air remained completely still. I stared out at the passing streetlights bleeding into long blurry streaks of yellow and red against the dark, wet asphalt. I began to rigorously analyze the specific psychological dynamics of the dinner I had just escaped. My father had always viewed me as a highly expendable asset. I was the quiet daughter who never demanded expensive clothes or lavish vacations. I was the one who hid in my bedroom writing code, while Jessica demanded the absolute center of his attention. But why would Marcus, a highly educated African-American corporate lawyer, risk his entire lucrative career to aggressively bully me into signing a collateral transfer? Marcus was an incredibly calculating man who never made a single move unless it directly benefited his own financial standing. He had sat at that mahogany table, radiating a toxic blend of extreme arrogance and deeply hidden panic. They had specifically targeted me tonight because I was the only moving piece they could not entirely control. Exactly 42 minutes later, my secure tablet chimed softly in the quiet darkness of the backseat. Thomas had delivered the encrypted dossier. I opened the digital file, and the bright, harsh light of the screen illuminated my face. My eyes scanned rapidly through hundreds of pages of standard commercial real estate leases, depreciating asset valuations, and terribly mismanaged corporate tax returns. My father's company was bleeding cash at an absolutely catastrophic rate. The profit margins were practically non-existent. But that was not the secret Marcus was desperately trying to hide. I kept scrolling deeper into the highly sensitive financial disclosures until my eyes locked onto a massive, glaring anomaly. It was a highly complex, heavily structured commercial mezzanine loan originated exactly 5 years ago. The total principal amount was exactly $4 million. The sheer size of the debt was staggering, considering the rapidly declining value of my father's actual physical assets. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart suddenly pounding heavily against my ribs as I read the intricate details of the underwriting agreement. The primary borrower was listed as the family freight company. But the secondary corporate guarantor, the financial anchor that had actually convinced the massive regional bank to approve the $4 million transfer, was not my father. It was my name. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. There, printed in stark black and white digital ink, was my full legal name, tied directly to the early incorporation documents of my proprietary software startup. 5 years ago, my tech company was just a quiet little limited liability corporation, but it was completely debt-free and attached to my absolutely pristine personal credit rating. I had foolishly left a physical folder of those early corporate registration papers in the bottom drawer of my old desk in my childhood bedroom. My father and Marcus had clearly found them. They had silently weaponized my spotless financial identity to secure a massive high-interest loan without ever breathing a single word to me. I frantically scrolled down to the final execution page of the deeply fraudulent contract. My blood turned to absolute ice. There, sitting perfectly on the designated dotted line, was my signature. It was a meticulous, highly practiced forgery, but it was undeniably fake. I had never seen this document in my entire life. I had never authorized a single penny of this massive corporate debt. But the absolute worst part was the official legal authentication stamped firmly right beside my forged signature. It was the registered state notary seal belonging to Marcus. My own brother-in-law had used his powerful position as a sworn officer of the court to officially authenticate a blatant malicious felony against me. He had legally rubber-stamped the total theft of my financial identity just to secure a cash injection for his father-in-law. It was an unprecedented act of extreme legal malpractice and federal wire fraud. The horrifying mechanics of their desperate plan suddenly became crystal clear. The $4 million loan was rapidly approaching its final balloon payment next week. My father was entirely out of cash, and the bank was actively preparing to seize his commercial assets. By ambushing me at dinner and trying to violently force me to sign that new liability transfer, they were desperately trying to legally legitimize the fraudulent debt they had secretly saddled me with 5 years ago. If I had signed those papers tonight, I would have legally accepted full financial responsibility for their massive hidden crimes. I would have handed them the keys to my $50 million empire just to pay off their dirty secrets. I immediately messaged Thomas and ordered a rapid forensic trace on the exact disbursement of the $4 million loan. I needed to know exactly where every single stolen dollar had gone. My father had loudly claimed at dinner that he desperately needed cash to expand his aging freight fleet and save the precious family legacy. But as Thomas sent the secondary banking records straight to my tablet, the final deeply sickening layer of their betrayal was completely exposed. The $4 million was never injected into the logistics company. It was never used to buy new trucks or upgrade the failing supply chain software. Instead, the moment the bank released the funds, the money was immediately fractured into a series of highly complex wire transfers. It was swiftly funneled through 3 different anonymous holding companies that Marcus had quietly established under his legal firm. I tracked the digital paper trail as it wove through the banking system. The final destination of every single stolen dollar was a private joint trust account owned exclusively by Jessica and Marcus. The truth washed over me in a suffocating wave of pure, absolute disgust. They did not commit federal wire fraud and identity theft to save a dying family business. They committed multiple major felonies simply to fund a massive lie. I closed my eyes and vividly pictured their sprawling 6-bedroom gated mansion located in one of the most exclusive and ridiculously expensive suburbs of Chicago. I thought about the brand new matching imported luxury SUVs sitting perfectly washed in their expansive heated driveway. I remembered the endless stream of social media posts showing Jessica on lavish European vacations dripping in high-end designer clothing. My golden child sister and her brilliant lawyer husband had built an entire shiny fake life using money they had stolen directly from my name. Jessica had sat at that dining table just 2 hours ago, perfectly content to swirl her expensive red wine and openly mock my little computer hobby. She had looked down her nose at me, calling me selfish for refusing to help our struggling father. All the while, she was fully aware that her pristine, perfect existence was entirely financed by my stolen future. My father had literally mortgaged my life without my knowledge, just to ensure his favorite daughter could comfortably continue playing the glamorous role of a wealthy, successful socialite. He had willingly risked sending me to absolute financial ruin and potential bankruptcy, so Jessica could keep taking extravagant trips, and Marcus could keep pretending to be a self-made legal titan. The profound magnitude of the betrayal was so deeply malignant that it completely eradicated any lingering trace of familial obligation I might have ever subconsciously held. I was not just the family scapegoat anymore. I was their designated financial victim. They had blindly assumed I was just a naive, struggling girl who would eventually cave to their intense emotional abuse. They had decided to play high-stakes corporate games with my life. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the reality of their impending destruction settle in. Sitting in the back of my armored car, looking at the undeniable proof of their federal crimes, a dark, deeply satisfying smile slowly spread across my face. They had absolutely no idea that I owned the entire casino, and I was about to burn their perfectly fabricated world completely to the ground. The digital files staring back at me from the glowing screen of my tablet painted a horrifyingly clear picture of the exact trap I had just narrowly escaped. The $4 million mezzanine loan was not just passively sitting on my father's books, it was actively detonating. According to the strict banking covenants embedded in the contract Thomas had forwarded to me, the massive balloon payment was scheduled to trigger in exactly 8 days. Next Friday, the regional bank would officially initiate full foreclosure proceedings against the Midwestern Freight and Logistics Company. When a bank forecloses on a commercial entity, they do not simply lock the doors and seize the delivery trucks. They immediately launch a relentless forensic audit into every single financial record to recover their lost capital. And that was the exact moment the devastating truth would have finally caught up with my arrogant brother-in-law. The moment the banking auditors opened those 5-year-old files, they would immediately realize the secondary corporate guarantor was a complete fabrication. They would instantly flag my forged signature and trace the illegal notary stamp directly back to Marcus and his prestigious downtown law firm. Marcus was an incredibly sharp, African-American corporate attorney who built his entire reputation on being the smartest man in any given room. He knew exactly what a federal banking audit would uncover. He knew his license to practice law would be instantly revoked, and he would be facing mandatory prison time for committing major wire fraud and identity theft. He also knew his perfectly curated life with my sister Jessica. The sprawling mansion, the imported luxury cars, the country club memberships would completely evaporate overnight. So he orchestrated a deeply malicious legal maneuver to save his own skin. The massive stack of papers my father had violently shoved across the mahogany dining table just hours ago was meticulously designed to be the ultimate liability shield. By aggressively bullying me into signing what they falsely claimed was a simple collateral assignment, Marcus was secretly attempting to execute a retroactive debt assumption. If my pen had touched that paper, I would have legally verified the forged documents from 5 years ago. I would have officially claimed the $4 million toxic debt as my own legitimate financial obligation, blocking the bank from investigating the initial forgery. The sheer absolute audacity of their coordinated ambush made my blood run incredibly cold. I sat in the back of the armored Cadillac Escalade and mentally replayed every single second of that disastrous dinner. It had been nothing but a highly calculated theatrical performance entirely designed to trigger my deepest childhood insecurities. My father had deliberately manufactured that explosive, terrifying rage to send me into a blind panic, hoping I would simply sign the documents to appease his volatile temper. Marcus had expertly played the calm, condescending legal authority, weaponizing his polished intellect to make me feel small and uneducated. He had dared to sit there in his expensive, tailored suit, lecturing me about family loyalty and necessary sacrifices, while actively attempting to push me in front of a massive financial train. And Jessica, my beautiful golden child sister, had played her part perfectly. She had sat there swirling her expensive red wine, watching my public humiliation with a smug, satisfied smirk, fully aware that my entire life was being offered up as a sacrificial lamb on the altar of her unearned luxury. They did not view me as a human being. They did not view me as a daughter or a sister. To them, I was nothing more than a highly convenient digital signature, a clean credit score they could exploit to cleanly wipe away their own dirty criminal tracks. For my entire life, I had carried a heavy, suffocating burden of guilt. I had always believed that my father's constant rejection was somehow my own fault because I was too quiet, or too rebellious, or too focused on my computer screens to fit into his traditional mold. I had spent countless lonely nights in my 20s desperately wondering what I could have possibly done to earn just a fraction of the unconditional love and aggressive financial support he so freely showered upon Jessica. But in the quiet, absolute darkness of my private vehicle, that lingering childhood sadness completely and permanently evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating, and deeply terrifying fury. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel a single ounce of heartbreak. The terrified 13-year-old girl who used to crave her father's basic approval officially died tonight, leaving only a ruthless $50 million tech executive in her place. I made a silent, unbreakable vow right there in the back of the SUV as the heavy Chicago rain continued to relentlessly pound against the bulletproof glass. They had fundamentally misunderstood the basic rules of engagement. They truly believed they were dealing with a weak, isolated young woman who would simply cry in her modest rental car and quietly fade back into the shadows of her pathetic little life. They thought their aggressive intimidation tactics had successfully chased me away before I could discover their massive financial crimes. They had absolutely no idea that by violently kicking me out of that house and trying to frame me for their impending ruin, they had just unleashed a predator with completely unlimited resources. I was not just going to walk away and silently protect my own assets. Walking away and surviving was no longer enough. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I was going to systematically, meticulously, and entirely legally dismantle every single pillar of their fraudulent, fake existence. I was going to strip away the stolen mansion, the luxury vehicles, the fake prestige, and the arrogant law firm partnership. I was going to make them feel exactly how small and completely powerless they had spent 30 years trying to make me feel. I stared at the glowing green confirmation receipt on my tablet and felt a profound, chilling sense of peace wash over my entire body. It was a strange, incredibly liberating sensation to suddenly realize that the people who were supposed to love and protect me had completely absolved me of any moral obligation to spare them. For years, I had silently worried about the crumbling state of my father's logistics company. I had genuinely wondered if I should offer them a quiet, anonymous financial bailout from my tech empire just to secure their future. I had spent countless hours debating if a massive, unearned cash injection would finally make my father look at me with the same beaming pride he always reserved for Jessica. I had wanted to save them, but seeing my own forged signature, meticulously crafted to drain my pristine credit rating, completely annihilated that pathetic childhood fantasy. They did not want me to save them. They wanted to feed me directly to the wolves so they could continue throwing lavish dinner parties and bragging about their empty, unearned wealth at their ridiculous country clubs. The sheer level of entitlement required to execute such an elaborate financial ambush was genuinely breathtaking. Marcus had confidently assumed my complete financial ignorance because I was a woman who built software instead of a man who moved heavy physical freight. His arrogant nature blinded him to the fact that my entire career was built on identifying complex digital anomalies and completely optimizing chaotic, massive datasets. Uncovering a sloppy, fraudulent mezzanine loan hidden in a regional bank portfolio was absolutely child's play compared to the predictive routing algorithms I wrote before breakfast. Marcus had severely underestimated his target, and in the high-stakes world of corporate finance, underestimating a billionaire opponent is an entirely fatal mistake. My father had violently yelled at me to get out of his house, acting like a powerful, untouchable king, banishing a worthless peasant from his pristine kingdom. But the absolute reality was that his kingdom was built entirely on a foundation of stolen money and desperate lies. I opened the encrypted communication channel on my secure tablet and immediately reconnected with Thomas, my lead corporate attorney. The time for quietly gathering digital intelligence was officially over. The counterattack needed to begin immediately before the regional bank initiated the standard foreclosure protocol next week. I quickly typed out a long, highly detailed list of aggressive financial directives. I instructed Thomas to bypass the standard banking channels and immediately contact the executive board of the regional bank holding my father's distressed mezzanine loan. I told him to completely conceal my personal identity behind the massive, impenetrable corporate veil of my primary holding company, Apex Capital. We were not going to simply report the illegal forgery to the local police and let a slow, bureaucratic legal system handle my family. That would be far too easy, and it would give Marcus an opportunity to leverage his powerful legal connections downtown to negotiate a plea deal. I wanted total, absolute financial destruction, and I wanted it executed with the precise, ruthless efficiency of a corporate hostile takeover. I explicitly ordered Thomas to prepare the massive cash reserves necessary to outright purchase the entirety of my father's commercial debt portfolio directly from the frantic bank. I knew the desperate financial institution would eagerly jump at the absolute fastest chance to completely offload $4 million of toxic, failing logistics debt for pure liquid cash. They would hand over the commercial deeds, the warehouse, liens, the truck titles, and the original forged loan documents without asking a single question. I watched the green confirmation receipt pop up on my glowing screen as Thomas immediately acknowledged the hostile acquisition orders. The trap Marcus had so carefully laid for me had officially been sprung, but the immense deadly jaws of that trap had just violently snapped shut, entirely around his own neck. He and my father were currently sitting in their warm, expensive house, eagerly patting each other on the back, believing they had successfully bought themselves a few more days to scheme their way out of bankruptcy. They were entirely oblivious to the terrifying reality that their greatest victim had just quietly bought the very bank that owned their lives. I closed my tablet and leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest of the Escalade, watching the dark, wet Chicago skyline roll past my window. The deep sadness was completely gone. I was fully awake, completely focused, and absolutely ready to go to war. They wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate survival. I was going to gladly show them exactly how a true titan of industry dismantles her enemies. Monday morning arrived with the crisp, brilliant light that only comes after a massive storm clears out of the city. I sat at the expansive marble conference table in the private executive suite of my downtown corporate headquarters. The incredible view of the sprawling Chicago skyline stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, but my absolute focus was entirely directed at the thick, leather-bound folders resting in front of me. Thomas, my lead corporate attorney, sat directly across the table, flanked by 3 of my senior financial analysts. Over the weekend, they had completely mapped out the entire intricate structure of my father's failing logistics empire and the incredibly toxic $4 million mezzanine loan Marcus had fraudulently secured using my forged signature. Thomas had explicitly advised me to immediately contact the federal authorities and file criminal charges for major wire fraud and identity theft. He legally outlined how Marcus would be instantly disbarred and face serious federal prison time, while my father would be held completely liable as the primary beneficiary of the stolen funds. It was the standard, perfectly logical legal route. But I looked at Thomas and absolutely refused. Calling the police would essentially hand over the complete control of my ultimate justice to a remarkably slow bureaucratic system. If I simply reported the massive forgery, Marcus would immediately leverage his highly connected downtown law firm to mount a vigorous white-collar defense. He would endlessly delay the proceedings, file countless legal motions, and potentially negotiate a highly favorable plea deal that would let him escape with a mere slap on the wrist. My father would desperately play the victim, claiming he had absolutely no idea his brilliant son-in-law had forged the critical documents. They would drag my name through the mud in open court, trying to paint me as a vindictive, estranged daughter. I was absolutely not going to give them the profound luxury of a courtroom battle where they could perform for a sympathetic judge. I did not want a messy public trial. I wanted an absolute surgical corporate kill shot. I wanted to completely dismantle their entire perfectly fabricated world from the inside out, using the very same financial weapons they had tried to use against me. I calmly instructed Thomas to entirely pivot our aggressive strategy away from criminal litigation and directly toward a massive hostile financial acquisition. My primary holding entity is an incredibly massive, deeply capitalized umbrella corporation named Apex Capital. It is a highly discreet, completely private wealth management vehicle that handles the massive revenues generated by my primary artificial intelligence algorithms. Apex Capital possesses hundreds of millions of dollars in highly liquid available cash reserves, specifically utilized for executing incredibly rapid, aggressive corporate buyouts. I told Thomas to immediately deploy Apex Capital to directly approach the specific regional bank that currently held my father's deeply fraudulent $4 million loan. We were going to bypass the police, bypass the court system, and simply buy the weapon that was currently pointed at my head. Thomas is a fiercely brilliant corporate shark who absolutely thrives on executing aggressive, hostile maneuvers. He instantly understood the profound magnitude of the strategy I was proposing. By outright purchasing the highly distressed commercial debt from the regional bank, Apex Capital would instantly assume the absolute legal position of the primary lender. We would entirely control the terms of the loan, the collateral assignments, and the impending foreclosure process. Thomas immediately mobilized my senior financial acquisition team, drafting the aggressive buyout proposals and preparing the massive liquid cash transfers necessary to completely shock the regional bank into immediate submission. I sat in my quiet, luxurious office, watching my highly paid team execute my exact orders with flawless, ruthless precision. It was an incredibly powerful, intensely surreal feeling. Just 3 nights ago, my father had aggressively dragged me by the arm and violently thrown my suitcase onto a muddy lawn, calling me a worthless disappointment. He genuinely thought he held all the power in the world. He had absolutely no idea that his quiet, discarded daughter was currently sitting in a multi-million-dollar penthouse suite, actively commanding a massive financial army to silently purchase his entire existence. The regional bank holding my father's deeply toxic loan was operating in a state of absolute quiet panic. Through our extensive covert financial investigations, Thomas had accurately discovered that my father had repeatedly missed his last 3 monthly interest payments. His outdated legacy logistics company was completely hemorrhaging cash, and the massive impending balloon payment scheduled for the end of the month was absolutely guaranteed to trigger a catastrophic total default. The regional bank executives desperately knew they were holding a completely worthless, rapidly depreciating commercial asset. If my father officially defaulted, they would be forced to execute a painfully slow, incredibly expensive commercial foreclosure. They would have to aggressively seize heavily depreciated diesel trucks, terribly outdated logistical warehouses, and completely attempt to liquidate a failing business in a deeply saturated market just to recover a small fraction of their original $4 million investment. The bank was staring down the barrel of a massive, devastating multi-million-dollar write-off that would severely damage their quarterly financial reports and highly infuriate their senior shareholders. When Thomas officially contacted the senior executive vice president of the regional bank on Tuesday morning, representing the incredibly wealthy anonymous holding company Apex Capital, it was exactly like throwing a massive life preserver to a drowning man. Thomas aggressively presented a completely unexpected, highly unorthodox financial proposition. He explicitly stated that Apex Capital was incredibly interested in rapidly acquiring the specific distressed logistics portfolio connected to Richard and his Midwestern freight company. Thomas did not ask for a massive discount or drag out the negotiations. He offered a clean, incredibly rapid transaction. Apex Capital would immediately wire the entire multi-million-dollar outstanding balance of the toxic loan directly into the regional bank's primary accounts in pure, untraceable liquid cash. In exchange, the bank would absolutely, immediately, quietly, and legally transfer the complete ownership of the debt, the original promissory notes, and all underlying collateral assignments entirely over to Apex Capital. The regional bank executives were absolutely, completely stunned by the sheer aggressive magnitude of the completely unsolicited cash offer. In the complex, high-stakes world of commercial banking, distressed, toxic debt is almost never purchased at full face value, especially when the primary borrowing company is actively failing. They completely assumed Apex Capital was simply a ruthless corporate liquidation firm looking to aggressively chop up my father's commercial assets and sell them off for parts. They truly did not care about the underlying reasons. The banking executives were so incredibly desperate to completely scrub the toxic, failing loan from their fragile financial ledgers that they completely rushed the entire approval process. They aggressively fast-tracked the massive commercial transaction, pushing it through their highest legal compliance departments with unprecedented blazing speed. By Thursday afternoon, exactly 4 days after my father had violently thrown me out into the freezing October rain, the massive financial transfer was officially complete. I sat alone in my pristine corner office, quietly watching the glowing monitor of my secure computer as the heavy digital confirmation receipt officially populated on my screen. The massive multi-million-dollar wire transfer from Apex Capital had successfully cleared the Federal Reserve tracking system. The regional bank had immediately accepted the liquid cash and systematically relinquished every single legal claim they held against my family. The massive, heavy legal binders, containing the deeply fraudulent loan documents, the forged notary stamps, and the extensive collateral agreements were hand-delivered directly to my corporate headquarters by a highly secure armed courier service. I slowly opened the incredibly thick leather-bound legal folder that Thomas had just placed gently on the center of my polished glass desk. I carefully turned the heavy, crisp pages of the commercial deed assignments, running my fingertips silently over the official embossed state seals and the highly detailed inventory lists. The profound absolute reality of my new position began to violently settle over my entire body. I was no longer just the deeply wealthy founder of a highly successful logistics algorithm. Through the aggressive, ruthless execution of Apex Capital, I was now officially my father's absolute sole financial creditor. I completely owned his entire world. I stared intensely at the highly detailed legal collateral sheets that Marcus had so arrogantly drafted in his desperate attempt to frame me for their impending ruin. Because my father had put up absolutely every single thing he owned to secure the initial fraudulent loan, I now legally possessed the ultimate master keys to his entire heavily guarded kingdom. I held the official, unencumbered commercial deeds to his 3 massive aging freight warehouses located on the gritty industrial outskirts of the city. I firmly held the absolute legal titles to his entire active fleet of 50 heavy-duty commercial diesel trucks, the very same trucks he had always proudly claimed were the true lifeblood of the real family legacy. I held the incredibly strict legal rights to seize his corporate bank accounts, to completely freeze his business payroll, and to instantly lock the heavy iron gates of his beloved company the exact moment I chose to trigger the default clause. But the absolute most devastating asset listed in the thick legal binder, the single piece of collateral that made my heart beat with a cold, deeply satisfying rhythm, was the primary residential deed to the massive, sprawling suburban house I had grown up in. My father was so incredibly financially desperate 5 years ago that he had actually leveraged the very roof over his own head alongside my forged signature just to secure the loan. He had aggressively stood on that covered porch in the pouring rain, looking down his nose at me, telling me I was entirely dead to him, while he physically threw me off his perfectly manicured property. He had violently screamed that it was his house and I was no longer welcome in it. He had completely believed he possessed the ultimate unshakable authority to banish me from his perfect life. He was absolutely, completely wrong. Because as I sat in my multi-million-dollar office reading the finalized bank transfer documents, I legally became the absolute primary owner of that exact same house. I owned the deeply manicured front lawn where my ruined clothes had been violently thrown into the mud. I owned the heavy oak front door he had aggressively slammed directly in my face. I owned the specific dining room where Jessica had sat swirling her expensive red wine, while Marcus arrogantly lectured me about making necessary family sacrifices. They were all currently sleeping incredibly soundly in their expensive warm beds, completely believing they had successfully bullied their way out of a total financial disaster. They truly believed their incredibly malicious forgery had successfully saved their lavish, luxurious existence. They had absolutely no idea that the toxic, catastrophic debt had not simply vanished into thin air. It had simply quietly changed hands. I did not need to scream or throw a violent temper tantrum to establish my absolute dominance. I did not need to physically drag anyone out into a storm to prove my sheer power. I simply used the massive, unimaginable wealth I had quietly built from the exact computer hobby my father constantly mocked to completely buy the entire ground right out from underneath his arrogant feet. My father had loudly declared that I was a useless burden who had completely failed to contribute to the family legacy. Now, I literally owned that entire legacy down to the very last rusty truck tire and every single brick of the family home. The incredibly cold, calculated trap Marcus had so desperately tried to spring on me had been entirely, completely reversed. I closed the heavy leather binder, sliding it carefully back across the polished glass desk, and looked out at the brilliant setting sun reflecting off the massive city skyline. I was absolutely ready for the next phase of their complete, total destruction. The sheer psychological weight of possessing this absolute power was intensely intoxicating. I had spent over a decade undergoing deep internal therapy, trying to carefully understand why my own blood relatives so easily discarded me. I had spent countless lonely nights completely wondering what fundamental flaw I possessed that made me so entirely unlovable to the man who was supposed to unconditionally protect me. My mother had always silently stood by, completely allowing my father to execute his cruel favoritism, treating Jessica like absolute royalty, while I was treated like a highly inconvenient afterthought. They had perfectly trained me to make myself incredibly small, to quietly disappear into the background, so they could comfortably shine in their completely fake suburban glory. But sitting in this towering glass office, holding the absolute legal rights to thoroughly dismantle their entire, perfectly fabricated existence, I finally understood the fundamental truth. I was never the problem. Their profound, intense arrogance and absolute toxic greed was the only issue. They had completely manufactured their own devastating demise through their relentless, malicious actions. My father had deliberately chosen to violently throw me out into the cold rain instead of simply asking for my help. Marcus had aggressively chosen to break multiple federal laws and completely forge my personal signature because he arrogantly assumed I was too financially illiterate to ever discover his incredibly sloppy tracks. Jessica had eagerly chosen to enthusiastically cheer on my total public humiliation, simply because it heavily fed her deep, endless need to be the absolute sole focus of our parents' toxic attention. Every single one of them had enthusiastically, eagerly participated in the exact malicious actions that ultimately led directly to this precise moment. I carefully picked up my secure phone and officially authorized Thomas to begin the next crucial phase of the aggressive, hostile operation. We were completely legally positioned to instantly destroy them without a single moment of warning, but I was absolutely not going to let them off that incredibly easy. I wanted them to deeply, intimately experience the exact same intense, suffocating panic they had so eagerly attempted to force onto me. I wanted them to reach the absolute highest peak of false, arrogant hope before I completely shattered their entire world. I instructed my massive legal team to deliberately remain completely silent about the aggressive internal acquisition. I strictly ordered them to officially let the regional bank quietly send the standard corporate notification stating the $4 million loan had been successfully sold to a highly private anonymous holding company named Apex Capital. I knew exactly how Marcus would immediately react to that specific corporate notification. His incredibly massive ego would instantly blind him to the terrifying impending danger. He would look at the completely sterile banking letter and arrogantly assume he had successfully bought himself significantly more time to aggressively negotiate. He would immediately assume that some distant, highly faceless corporate entity had simply absorbed the debt and that he could easily use his polished legal charm to easily manipulate this newly anonymous holding company into granting them a massive financial extension. He would absolutely sprint back to my father, proudly bragging that his brilliant, incredible legal strategy had miraculously saved the precious family legacy from total impending ruin. They would definitely start eagerly planning a massive, lavish celebration, fully believing they had completely outsmarted the entire banking system, while entirely successfully dodging the massive federal felony they had so recklessly committed. The incredibly deep, complex irony of the entire situation was almost too beautifully poetic to fully comprehend. They were about to begin aggressively negotiating for their entire financial survival, directly with the exact same daughter they had just violently kicked to the curb. I quietly locked the heavy legal binder firmly into my secure corporate safe, completely securing the ultimate financial weapon that would perfectly guarantee their absolute total destruction. The cold, ruthless counterattack had been completely successfully launched, and I was absolutely, completely ready to watch them unknowingly dig their own massive, inescapable graves. I took one final deep breath of the perfectly conditioned office air, feeling absolutely, incredibly unstoppable. The game was entirely mine now. All I had to do was patiently, quietly wait for my incredibly arrogant brother-in-law to confidently make the absolute worst mistake of his entire miserable life. The very next morning, my secure tablet chimed with a high-priority notification from Thomas. It was an intercepted email chain. Marcus had officially made contact. He had somehow tracked down the generic corporate email address for Apex Capital and initiated negotiations exactly as I had predicted. The sheer arrogance radiating from his initial message was almost physically palpable. He introduced himself as the senior legal counsel for a major Midwestern logistics conglomerate, completely failing to mention that the conglomerate in question was rapidly bleeding cash and literally days away from total operational collapse. He did not politely ask for a temporary extension on the $4 million distressed debt. He aggressively demanded one using incredibly dense, convoluted legal jargon designed strictly to intimidate whoever was reading his ridiculous email. I sat in my massive leather office chair, quietly sipping a perfectly brewed espresso while I read his pathetic demands. Marcus confidently asserted that the recent abrupt transfer of the commercial debt from the regional bank to Apex Capital had entirely disrupted his client's incredibly complex restructuring timeline. He essentially threatened to completely tie up the new holding company in years of aggressive, grueling litigation if they dared to initiate standard foreclosure proceedings next week. He was attempting to actively bully the massive anonymous holding company, fully believing he was dealing with some low-level, incredibly inexperienced corporate analyst who would simply panic at the mere mention of a protracted legal battle. He had absolutely no idea that his aggressive, highly threatening emails were being forwarded directly to the very sister-in-law he had violently thrown out of the house just 5 days earlier. I immediately forwarded the email chain directly back to Thomas with a set of incredibly strict, unyielding instructions. I ordered my legal team to completely play along with Marcus and his pathetic little game. Thomas was instructed to reply using the incredibly formal, sterile corporate tone of a massive, unfeeling financial institution. He was to subtly acknowledge Marcus as a highly respected attorney and gently agree that a mutually beneficial restructuring agreement might actually be possible. I wanted Thomas to carefully, expertly feed Marcus just enough false hope to make him truly believe his aggressive legal intimidation tactics were actually working perfectly. I wanted Marcus to feel like an absolute genius. The incredibly rapid digital back and forth over the next 48 hours was genuinely fascinating to watch. I sat quietly in my multi-million-dollar penthouse, completely monitoring the entire blind negotiation in real time. Marcus would aggressively send a highly demanding, incredibly condescending email demanding heavily reduced interest rates and a massive 5-year extension on the balloon payment. Thomas, acting perfectly as my anonymous corporate proxy, would reply with carefully calculated resistance, slowly, reluctantly agreeing to minor concessions. Marcus was actively negotiating for his very financial survival, but his incredibly massive ego absolutely refused to let him beg. He was constantly desperately trying to firmly establish an artificial position of power over a holding company that literally owned his entire life. By late Wednesday afternoon, Marcus had become absolutely insufferable. He sent a deeply arrogant, incredibly smug message to Thomas, confidently boasting that his prominent downtown Chicago law firm was more than fully prepared to completely bury Apex Capital in endless injunctions if they refused to immediately finalize the new, incredibly generous loan terms he had just proposed. He essentially told Thomas that Apex Capital was incredibly lucky to be doing business with such a prestigious, heavily connected family empire. I read that specific email and let out a cold, sharp, deeply cynical laugh. It was finally time to completely set the hook and drag him into the boat. I instantly messaged Thomas and officially gave him the green light to enthusiastically accept every single one of Marcus' ridiculous demands. I instructed Thomas to formally draft an incredibly comprehensive brand new restructuring agreement that officially gave my father the massive 5-year extension and heavily reduced interest rates they were so desperately begging for. But I firmly attached one incredibly specific, completely non-negotiable condition to the final approval. Thomas expertly drafted the final email. He respectfully informed Marcus that the incredibly anonymous, incredibly reclusive founder of Apex Capital had personally reviewed the new commercial terms and had surprisingly agreed to fully authorize the massive financial bailout. However, due to the extremely high-risk nature of the heavily distressed logistics portfolio, the incredibly elusive founder absolutely required a highly public, deeply formal signing ceremony to officially execute the final commercial transfer. The founder heavily insisted on completely assuring their own massive private shareholders that this extremely risky acquisition was fundamentally completely sound. The strict final condition was absolute. The new, deeply generous restructuring agreement could only be officially finalized and signed in person at a massive, highly visible corporate event. I knew exactly what I was asking for, and I knew exactly how my deeply image-obsessed family would react to this incredibly specific demand. They did not just want to quietly survive their massive financial disaster. They desperately wanted to actively perform their survival for an audience. They lived entirely for external validation. They spent their entire lives aggressively projecting a completely flawless, wealthy image to their snobby country club friends and their incredibly judgmental suburban neighbors. The massive, terrifying threat of total bankruptcy had been actively keeping my father and Marcus awake at night, not because they feared losing the actual physical business, but because they deeply, intensely feared the sheer public humiliation of totally losing their social status. When Marcus received Thomas' email containing the incredible final condition, he absolutely enthusiastically devoured the bait hook, line, and sinker. He immediately replied with a deeply unctuous, overly professional message, eagerly, completely accepting the terms without a single second of hesitation. He enthusiastically informed Thomas that the logistics company was actually already scheduled to host a massive, highly anticipated annual corporate gala that exact coming weekend. It was an incredibly lavish, expensive event, traditionally attended by local Chicago politicians, prominent business leaders, and hundreds of their wealthy friends. Marcus aggressively insisted that this high-profile gala would be the absolute perfect, incredibly prestigious venue for the anonymous founder of Apex Capital to publicly sign the massive restructuring agreement and firmly cement their new, powerful corporate partnership. I sat in my office staring at Marcus' incredibly eager response and felt a profound, chillingly sharp sense of pure vindication wash over me. He had so effortlessly walked directly into the exact center of my trap. My father and Marcus were going to actively spend the next 3 days aggressively pumping up this massive gala, loudly bragging to every single person in their incredibly shallow social circle about how they had brilliantly, successfully navigated a minor corporate hiccup. They were going to eagerly, proudly introduce the incredibly powerful, anonymous savior, holding company to their entire, highly judgmental world. They were completely actively setting the massive, incredibly public stage for their own total, absolute devastation, and they were doing it all with giant, confident, arrogant smiles on their faces. I quietly approved the final logistics for my massive private security team and began meticulously preparing the incredibly damning legal documents that would perfectly execute the final, ultimate corporate kill shot. 2 hours before the rain soaked through my clothes on the front lawn, I was sitting at the massive mahogany dining table in my childhood home in Chicago. The air in the room was thick and suffocating under the weight of my father's manufactured authority. Richard did not ask for meetings. He summoned people. He had summoned me here tonight under the guise of a rare family dinner. But the stack of legal documents resting next to his untouched plate of steak told a very different story. For as long as I can remember, my father measured a person's worth by the weight of the dirt on their boots and the size of the engines they commanded. He inherited a Midwestern freight and logistics company from my grandfather and spent the next 3 decades acting like he was a titan of industry. He loved the smell of diesel. He loved walking through his warehouses barking orders. But the world had moved on. Supply chains digitized. Logistics became about algorithms, not just brute force. His company was bleeding money, suffocating under outdated systems, and his own arrogant refusal to adapt. Of course, nobody was allowed to say that out loud. In this house, Richard was a king, and his failures were always someone else's fault. Sitting across from him was my younger sister Jessica, who was casually swirling a glass of expensive red wine. She was the undeniable golden child, the one who did everything right by my parents' standards. Next to her sat her husband, Marcus. Marcus was a highly successful corporate attorney at a downtown firm, a sharp, impeccably dressed African-American man who commanded respect in courtrooms and completely dominated our family gatherings. My father absolutely adored Marcus. Marcus provided the legal muscle for my father's business and fed his ego perfectly. To them, I was just Harper. I was the weird, quiet daughter who moved away, stared at screens all day, and played with code instead of getting a real job. My father cleared his throat and tapped his heavy gold watch against the polished wood table. He did not look at me with the warmth of a parent welcoming their child home. He looked at me like a landlord inspecting a leaky pipe. He picked up the thick stack of legal documents and slid them roughly across the table. The heavy paper stopped right in front of my hands. He told me he needed me to sign these tonight, his voice carrying that booming, absolute tone he used on his truck drivers. I looked down at the documents. The bold print at the top read, "Liability transfer and collateral assignment." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I looked up and quietly asked him what this was. Marcus answered before my father could even open his mouth. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his silk tie with a deeply patronizing smile. He told me it was a simple collateral agreement. He explained that my father was securing a bridge loan to expand the freight fleet and that the bank needed a secondary guarantor with clean credit to push the underwriting through. Marcus then casually mentioned they were rolling my little app company in as a collateral asset, claiming it was just a formality. I stared at Marcus, and then I looked at my father. I asked him if he really wanted me to sign over my business to secure a loan for his company. Jessica scoffed, rolling her eyes and checking her perfectly manicured nails. She told me not to make it sound so dramatic. She said Dad was just trying to save the family legacy, and that the least I could do was help out with my little computer hobby. My father leaned forward, placing his heavy hands flat on the table. He told me to listen to him. He said the freight business was real work, that it was tangible, and put food on tables. He looked me right in the eye and said the little startup thing I had been playing around with for the last decade was not a real career. He claimed he was giving me a chance to actually contribute to this family. He promised that if I signed those papers, the bank would see a secondary asset, the loan would clear, and his company would keep running. I looked down at the signature lines. I saw Marcus had stamped his name as the primary legal counsel handling the transfer. The math simply did not make sense. A massive legacy company does not need a tiny startup to secure a standard fleet expansion loan unless the primary company is completely underwater. My father was not expanding. He was drowning. And Marcus had drafted a contract that would legally bind my personal assets to my father's sinking ship. They thought my company was worthless, yet they were desperate enough to use it as a life raft. I looked up and said no. The word dropped into the dining room like a brick. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. My father growled, asking me to excuse myself, as his face instantly turned a deep shade of crimson. I kept my voice completely level. I told him I was not signing these documents. I said I was not putting my company up as collateral for his freight business because my business belongs to me. Marcus let out a short, condescending laugh. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, speaking to me in the slow, exaggerated tone one might use with a stubborn toddler. He told me to be realistic. He said I ran a tiny software project and did not understand corporate finance or mezzanine debt. He praised my father's legacy logistics empire. Then Marcus looked at me with pure arrogance and said that when a family faces a cash flow bottleneck, family requires sacrifice. He told me that is how dynasties survive. He finished by saying I could not possibly be so selfish that I would let my father's life work struggle just to protect a computer game. I stared directly into his dark, calculating eyes and told him it was not a game, and it was certainly not available for him to leverage. My father slammed his fist onto the mahogany table so hard the wine glasses rattled violently. He roared at me, calling me an ungrateful parasite while the veins bulged in his neck. He yelled that he had put a roof over my head and fed me. He said he had to watch me waste my life staring at screens while my sister actually made something of herself. He praised Jessica for marrying a partner at a law firm and building a life, then asked me what I had built. He told me I contribute nothing. I looked over at Jessica. She was casually sipping her wine, watching the spectacle with a smug, satisfied smirk. She absolutely loved this. She loved watching me be reduced to nothing in our father's eyes. My father pointed a shaking finger at the documents and demanded I pick up the pen and sign my name. He shouted that if I did not sign those papers right then and there, I was no longer a part of this family and I would be dead to him. He fully expected me to break. He thought the threat of losing his conditional toxic love would force me to surrender. He honestly believed he was intimidating a struggling, naive girl who desperately needed his validation. He did not know that the little computer hobby he was screaming about was currently revolutionizing global supply chain routing. He did not know that I owned 100% of a proprietary artificial intelligence firm that completely dwarfed his entire net worth. And he certainly had no idea that my personal legal team had already warned me about Marcus and his shady corporate filings. I stood up slowly, leaving the pen exactly where it was. I looked at the angry, desperate man who had never once bothered to ask what my company actually did. I told him I was not signing anything, my voice eerily calm against his raging temper. I told him I thought it was best if I left. The sheer silence that followed my words was heavy and pregnant with the realization that I was actually defying him. Then the anger took over completely, setting the stage for the rain-soaked exile that would permanently alter all of our lives. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel in downtown Chicago was undeniably a spectacle of excessive, unearned opulence. It was the exact type of lavish, overly decorated venue my father absolutely thrived in. Massive, glittering crystal chandeliers hung heavily from the high vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, golden light over 30 perfectly arranged tables. The floral centerpieces alone, tall, elaborate arrangements of imported white orchids and incredibly rare hydrangeas, cost more than the average blue-collar worker earned in an entire month. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided smoothly across the highly polished marble floor, carrying silver trays loaded with premium champagne and expensive beluga caviar. A soft, elegant string quartet played quietly in the corner, providing the perfect, sophisticated background noise for the wealthy elite to comfortably mingle and aggressively network. This was exactly the kind of highly curated, exclusive environment where my father and Marcus felt they truly belonged. They had actively invited over 300 guests to this ridiculous corporate gala. The expansive room was completely packed with local Chicago politicians, wealthy Midwestern business partners, and hundreds of their incredibly judgmental country club friends. It was a massive, perfectly orchestrated vanity project, designed strictly to completely obscure the terrifying reality of their impending financial ruin. My father Richard stood directly near the front entrance of the massive ballroom, aggressively holding court. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that stretched slightly over his broad shoulders. He held a glass of dark amber scotch in his right hand, using his left hand to aggressively pat the backs of passing local politicians and prominent regional bank managers. He was loudly boasting about the incredible, massive expansion of his legacy freight company, enthusiastically telling anyone who would listen that this coming year would absolutely be their most profitable, completely historic quarter ever. He looked incredibly proud, deeply arrogant, and utterly oblivious to the massive financial execution that was rapidly approaching. A few feet away, Marcus was surrounded by a tight circle of incredibly wealthy, prominent downtown attorneys and senior corporate partners. He was in his absolute element. He was aggressively holding a flute of expensive vintage champagne, his perfectly groomed face shining with intense, smug satisfaction. I could easily imagine the exact incredibly arrogant words leaving his mouth. He was definitely subtly hinting at a massive, incredibly complex corporate restructuring he had just brilliantly finalized, proudly portraying himself as a ruthless legal genius who had single-handedly saved a major Midwestern empire. He was desperately using the massive, fabricated success of his fraudulent financial maneuver to aggressively secure his impending promotion to named partner at his prestigious law firm. Jessica, my golden child sister, stood exactly where she always did, right at the absolute glittering center of attention. She wore a stunning floor-length emerald green designer gown that perfectly caught the soft chandelier light. She was actively laughing loudly, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair and casually sipping her expensive champagne while accepting endless shallow compliments from the older wealthy women in the room. Just a few hours ago, she had maliciously texted me a blurry photo of that exact same green dress, aggressively mocking my modest life and proudly bragging that our father had completely saved the company without my worthless little computer app. She had confidently told me to stay entirely out of their pristine lives. I had replied with just one single incredibly simple word: noted. They were all actively, deeply intoxicating themselves on a massive, terrifying illusion. They completely believed the deeply anonymous, massive holding company, Apex Capital, was exactly the kind of incredibly gullible, incredibly naive financial entity they could easily manipulate and aggressively string along for years. They actually thought tonight was a massive victory lap. They genuinely believed this lavish, incredibly expensive party was the ultimate perfect setting to publicly, confidently sign the brand new, generous bailout terms. They were completely actively preparing to loudly introduce their wealthy, anonymous corporate savior to their entire incredibly shallow, judgmental social circle. Exactly 3 blocks away from the glittering hotel, my absolute reality was moving rapidly through the dark, wet Chicago streets. A highly coordinated fleet of 4 identical matte black armored Cadillac Escalades moved in absolute silent, terrifying unison down the slick, rain-soaked avenue. The heavy, massive vehicles did not look like standard luxury limousines. They looked exactly like a highly trained, incredibly aggressive presidential security detail moving with intense, precise military efficiency. My lead driver, David, navigated the heavy armored SUV with absolute smooth, practiced control, while my private security team sat perfectly still in the surrounding vehicles, completely mentally prepared for the highly public extraction. I sat in the spacious, perfectly quiet back seat of the primary Escalade, staring blankly out the thick, bulletproof glass at the glowing city lights. I was absolutely not the incredibly quiet, terrified 13-year-old girl they had violently thrown out onto a muddy porch all those years ago. And I was certainly not the naive, struggling app developer they had arrogantly tried to aggressively frame for their massive corporate fraud just last week. Tonight, I was exactly what I had spent the last decade quietly, meticulously building myself to be. I was a completely ruthless $50 million tech executive, and I was dressed exactly for the incredibly hostile corporate kill shot I was about to execute. I wore a stunning custom-tailored, razor-sharp, charcoal gray designer power suit. The incredibly fine imported Italian wool was flawlessly cut to project absolute total authority and devastating, unyielding control. I wore classic understated black stilettos and simple, incredibly expensive diamond stud earrings. There was absolutely no flashy jewelry, no ridiculous, excessive makeup. True unimaginable wealth and absolute total power do not ever need to aggressively scream for attention. They simply quietly, terrifyingly arrive. The fleet of massive black Escalades smoothly, confidently turned onto the exclusive circular cobblestone driveway of the Drake Hotel. The incredibly heavy, imposing vehicles immediately commanded the absolute, complete attention of every single person standing outside. The bustling, busy valet stand suddenly incredibly ground to an absolute dead halt. The eager young valets wearing their crisp, formal uniforms froze completely in place, staring wide-eyed at the terrifying, silent approach of the armored convoy. Several wealthy guests who were waiting under the massive heated awning for their own luxury cars completely stopped talking, turning their heads to openly stare at the deeply imposing corporate display. The 4 heavy Escalades perfectly smoothly stopped in a precise, highly coordinated formation, completely blocking the entire exclusive front entrance of the hotel. Before the primary engine even fully settled into a quiet hum, the doors of the surrounding vehicles simultaneously opened. 8 massive, highly trained security operatives, wearing sharp dark suits and visible earpieces, stepped out into the cool night air, moving with incredible fast-efficient precision. They immediately secured the immediate perimeter, establishing a tight, highly controlled human barrier around the primary vehicle. David, my lead driver, smoothly stepped out of the front seat and quickly walked around to the heavy, reinforced rear door of my Escalade. He did not rush. He moved with the calm, practiced dignity of a man who routinely handled incredibly high-value assets. The entire front entrance of the luxury hotel had gone completely, absolutely silent. The valets, the wealthy guests, the doormen. They were all simply watching, completely captivated by the incredibly intense display of raw, unimaginable power. David reached out and firmly pulled the heavy armored door open. I stepped out of the dark, luxurious cabin and placed my sleek black stiletto firmly onto the wet cobblestone. The cool, crisp night air immediately hit my face, but I felt absolutely nothing but pure, cold, calculating focus. I stood up to my full height, smoothing the sharp lapels of my custom designer suit. I did not look around at the openly staring faces. I did not acknowledge the completely stunned valet who was nervously holding a parking ticket he clearly knew he would never dare to hand me. I simply kept my eyes locked directly, completely forward on the massive glowing brass doors of the hotel entrance. Thomas, my brilliant, highly aggressive lead corporate attorney, stepped smoothly out of the second Escalade. He carried a sleek, heavy locking leather briefcase completely secured to his wrist. Inside that incredibly heavy case were the final, absolute, unyielding corporate documents that would completely legally transfer every single remaining asset my father possessed directly into my complete, absolute control. Thomas adjusted his expensive silk tie and fell exactly into step, perfectly slightly behind my right shoulder. My lead security operative gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, and the tight protective formation began to move smoothly toward the massive brass doors. The small crowd of wealthy hotel guests quickly nervously parted, stepping back to completely clear a wide, unquestioned path for us. They did not know exactly who I was, but the incredibly heavy, terrifying aura of absolute total consequence walking with me made them instinctively, physically step back. I walked steadily through the glowing glass revolving doors and stepped directly into the incredibly lavish main lobby of the Drake Hotel. The air inside was warm, completely smelling of expensive perfume and massive, excessive wealth. From down the long, highly decorated corridor, I could faintly hear the soft, elegant sounds of the string quartet and the loud, booming, arrogant laughter of my father completely echoing out from the grand ballroom. He was aggressively, proudly holding court, completely, thoroughly convinced he had miraculously survived his massive financial disaster. He actually genuinely thought the incredibly powerful, highly anonymous holding company, Apex Capital, was coming tonight simply to quietly hand him a massive, desperately needed lifeline. He had absolutely no idea that the total, absolute, terrifying reality of his impending destruction had just confidently walked through the front doors. I kept my face entirely perfectly blank, an absolute mask of a cold, unyielding corporate execution as I walked steadily down the long, bright corridor directly toward the massive open doors of the grand ballroom. The final incredibly satisfying act of their complete, total devastation was about to officially, absolutely begin. I stood perfectly still in the shadowed vestibule just outside the grand ballroom, listening to the booming, amplified voice of my father echoing through the heavy oak doors. Richard was in his absolute element. He was holding court over hundreds of Chicago elite, standing confidently at the center stage microphone with a crystal flute of champagne raised high in the air. His voice carried that familiar, intoxicating arrogance that had defined my entire childhood. He was actively delivering a passionate, heavily rehearsed speech about the immense value of sheer determination and unyielding family loyalty. The profound hypocrisy of those two words coming from his mouth actually made Thomas let out a sharp, cynical breath right beside me. My father boldly proclaimed to the massive room that true legacy businesses like his Midwestern freight empire survive because they are built on a solid foundation of absolute trust and unwavering dedication to the bloodline. He paused for dramatic effect, soaking in the polite applause and the gentle clinking of expensive crystal. He then eagerly pivoted to the absolute highlight of his deeply fraudulent performance. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket and proudly announced that tonight was not just a simple celebration of survival, but a massive, historic, corporate milestone. He loudly told the crowd that a massive, incredibly prestigious private wealth fund had stepped in at the final hour. He puffed out his chest and confidently declared that the highly elusive board of directors at Apex Capital had meticulously reviewed his freight company and had officially recognized his absolute sheer brilliance. He bragged that this anonymous financial titan had seen the immense, undeniable value in his legacy and had eagerly rushed to partner with him, effectively wiping away any temporary operational hurdles. He enthusiastically raised his glass toward Marcus, who was standing near the front tables, and publicly praised his brilliant son-in-law for expertly facilitating this magnificent corporate salvation, loudly announcing Marcus' impending promotion to named partner at his downtown law firm. He was actively feeding his own massive ego, completely convinced that he had brilliantly charmed a faceless billionaire into saving his lavish lifestyle, while utterly discarding the daughter he considered a total failure. My lead security operative looked at me and gave a single sharp nod. I did not say a word. I simply stepped forward, and the two massive mahogany doors were instantly violently pushed open by my security detail. The heavy brass hinges let out a low, resonant groan that completely cut through the polite applause echoing across the opulent ballroom. I stepped out of the shadows and directly into the brilliant, blinding light of the crystal chandeliers. For the first few seconds, nobody at the front of the room even noticed, but the wealthy guests standing near the back tables instantly froze. The lively, sophisticated chatter completely died in my immediate vicinity, replaced by a sudden, heavy, suffocating silence that began to rapidly ripple outward like a dark wave. I walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom with absolute, unyielding purpose. Thomas walked perfectly in step, slightly behind my right shoulder, holding the heavy leather briefcase containing their absolute financial ruin. The rhythmic, sharp click of my black stilettos against the polished marble floor echoed loudly in the incredibly quiet room. The crowd of local politicians, prominent business owners, and judgmental country club socialites instinctively physically parted, stepping back to clear a wide, unmistakable path for me. They openly stared at my stunning, custom-tailored charcoal power suit, the incredibly expensive diamond studs catching the light, and the towering wall of professional security operatives flanking me. I looked exactly like the absolute billionaire titan of industry I had secretly become. The incredibly heavy silence aggressively spread all the way to the front tables, completely swallowing the room. Jessica was standing perfectly positioned right beside the main stage, holding her expensive champagne and completely soaking in our father's arrogant speech. I kept my eyes locked entirely forward, but I saw the exact horrifying moment her brain registered my physical presence. Her perfectly manicured fingers went completely slack. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped directly through her grip and violently shattered against the hard marble floor. The loud, sharp crash of breaking glass snapped like a gunshot through the dead, quiet ballroom. The bubbling champagne splashed wildly, soaking the bottom hem of her beautiful designer gown, but she did not even flinch. She just stood there, completely paralyzed, her eyes wide with absolute sheer terror. My father, who was still holding the microphone, completely froze mid-sentence. The confident, booming words entirely died in his throat. His mouth hung slightly open, his broad chest completely stopped moving, and the microphone let out a high-pitched screech of painful feedback as his hand began to visibly tremble. The smug, triumphant color entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified old man standing on a stage he no longer owned. The absolute total paralysis gripping my family was incredibly intoxicating to witness, but Marcus was far too arrogant and far too aggressive to simply stand there and watch his perfect evening be interrupted. His massive, highly fragile ego demanded immediate corrective action. He quickly handed his drink to a completely stunned waiter and violently marched down the short set of stage stairs, moving directly toward me with intense physical aggression. He was desperately trying to reassert his dominant alpha male persona in front of the massive wealthy crowd, completely unaware of the absolute corporate slaughter that was currently hanging over his head. Marcus rapidly closed the distance and aggressively stepped directly into the center of the aisle, attempting to physically block my path to the stage. My lead security operative instantly stepped forward to intercept him, placing a firm, massive hand on Marcus' shoulder, but I raised a single calm finger, signaling my team to stand down. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from my deeply arrogant brother-in-law. Marcus was practically vibrating with intense, poorly concealed rage, his face flushed with extreme anger. He leaned down slightly, lowering his voice into a harsh, threatening whisper deliberately designed to completely intimidate me. He aggressively hissed that I had an incredible amount of absolute nerve showing my pathetic face at this prestigious event. He told me I was completely cut off and that my presence here was a massive, deeply embarrassing mistake. He arrogantly warned me that if I did not turn around and quietly walk out the front door right this very second, he was going to personally have hotel security physically drag me out into the street. He puffed out his chest, looking down at me with the exact same toxic condescension he had used in the dining room 5 days ago. He mocked my custom suit completely, assuming it was a cheap rental, and he leaned in closer to deliver his ultimate insult. He aggressively whispered that it was an absolute tragedy I was completely cut off from the family wealth because my father had just brilliantly saved the entire company without the help of my worthless little computer app. He told me to stay entirely out of their pristine lives and to go back to my pathetic, tiny apartment. He truly believed he was still entirely in control of my fate. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single microscopic ounce of fear or intimidation. The sheer profound irony of his aggressive little speech almost made me laugh out loud, but I maintained an absolute mask of bold calculating execution. I simply looked at his furious, sweating face and quietly, calmly uttered one single devastating word. Noted. I smoothly reached into the inner pocket of my custom designer blazer and pulled out a single thick, matte black business card. The incredibly heavy premium cardstock featured absolute pristine silver embossed lettering that caught the bright chandelier light perfectly. I held it perfectly steady between my fingers and calmly handed it directly to his chest, forcing him to either take it or let it fall to the floor. Marcus aggressively snatched the card from my hand, letting out a sharp, pathetic scoff, completely expecting it to be some ridiculous, desperate plea for money or a pathetic written apology for ruining their flawless family dinner. I stood perfectly still, my hands calmly folded in front of me, and watched his incredibly arrogant, dark eyes drop down to read the glowing silver text. I actively watched the physical cognitive processing happen in real time. I watched his eyes scan my full legal name, Harper, printed boldly across the top. I watched his gaze slide directly over to the official corporate title, Founder and Chief Executive Officer. And then I watched the exact, incredibly beautiful, horrifying moment when his eyes finally locked onto the massive bold letters of my private holding company, Apex Capital. The transition was absolutely breathtaking. It was the physical manifestation of total, absolute psychological destruction. All the aggressive, arrogant blood completely, instantly drained out of his face, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying shade of pale gray. His mouth opened, closing silently, like a suffocating fish. His knees physically buckled slightly, sending a highly visible tremor straight up his spine. His incredibly expensive tailored suit suddenly looked far too large for his rapidly shrinking body. His jaw went entirely slack, and the hand holding my business card began to visibly, uncontrollably shake violently. The massive, horrifying reality of what he had done completely crashed down upon his entire existence in one single, agonizing second. He finally realized that he was not aggressively intimidating an estranged little sister. He was standing completely defenseless in front of the absolute sole owner of his entire fraudulent life. He slowly raised his terrified, completely shattered eyes to meet my cold, unyielding gaze. And in that beautiful, perfect silence, he finally understood that his entire world was officially over. I left Marcus standing completely frozen in the middle of the grand ballroom aisle. The incredibly arrogant, highly polished corporate attorney who had just threatened to have me physically dragged out into the cold, wet street was now utterly paralyzed by a single piece of premium black cardstock. I did not give him another second of my time or a single shred of my attention. I did not bother to look back to see his face continue to drain of color or watch his perfectly tailored, expensive suit suddenly look entirely too large for his rapidly shrinking body. I simply kept walking forward with absolute, unyielding momentum. My black stilettos resumed their sharp, incredibly rhythmic clicking against the highly polished, expensive marble floor, entirely cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence that had suddenly completely swallowed the massive, opulent room. The sea of wealthy Chicago elite local politicians and prominent business leaders remained completely parted, forming a wide, undeniable physical path directly toward the heavily illuminated main stage. I could physically feel the heavy, intense weight of 300 pairs of eyes actively tracking my every single calculated movement, but I kept my posture absolutely rigid and my gaze locked directly entirely onto the man standing blindly behind the center microphone. My father. The sheer absolute contrast between my father's previously booming, confident voice and the sudden, terrifying, dead silence of the ballroom was incredibly, incredibly stark. Richard was still standing at the absolute center of the wide, elevated stage. He was aggressively gripping the thin metal microphone stand with a large, heavy hand that was now violently, visibly shaking. The booming, incredibly confident voice he had just used to praise his own manufactured brilliant business acumen and loudly boast about the massive anonymous holding company that had supposedly flawlessly saved his precious Midwestern freight empire was completely, entirely gone. He looked exactly like an exhausted, terrified man who had just seen a massive, terrifying ghost physically materialize directly under the bright, glittering crystal chandeliers. I walked slowly, purposefully, and completely confidently up the short flight of plush, carpeted steps, leading directly onto the raised platform. Thomas, my brilliant, highly aggressive lead corporate attorney, followed incredibly smoothly right behind my right shoulder, completely tightly securing the heavy locking leather briefcase that contained the absolute, total, undeniable financial ruin of my entire corrupt family. As I stepped fully onto the plush stage, the bright, intense heat of the massive overhead spotlights immediately hit my face, but I absolutely did not blink or turn away. I walked directly, deliberately up to my frozen father. Up close, the absolute sheer, unadulterated terror violently radiating from his rigid body was completely undeniable. His custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo suddenly looked incredibly pathetic and heavily outdated. The heavy, familiar scent of his expensive vintage scotch heavily mingled with the sharp, sour, unmistakable smell of pure, primitive human fear. He slowly opened his mouth to speak, to aggressively command me to leave the stage to exert the highly toxic, overbearing parental authority he had systematically used to aggressively control me my entire life. But absolutely no sound came out. His jaw just worked uselessly up and down in a silent, desperate, incredibly pathetic stutter. I did not pause to ask for his permission. I did not wait for an invitation. I reached out with a perfectly steady, heavily manicured hand and simply physically took the microphone directly out of his trembling fingers. He let the metal handle go without a single microscopic ounce of physical resistance, completely stepping backward, as if the microphone stand was suddenly burning, incredibly hot. I slowly, deliberately turned to face the massive, incredibly opulent hotel ballroom. The room was so completely, terrifyingly silent that I could actually clearly hear the soft, delicate rustling of expensive imported silk gowns as the incredibly wealthy, nervous guests shifted highly uncomfortably in their plush, assigned seats. I looked out over the massive sea of upturned faces, easily recognizing many of the deeply judgmental country club friends, arrogant business partners, and highly connected local politicians who had spent years openly looking down on me, just as my toxic parents had actively successfully taught them to do. I brought the microphone carefully to my mouth and let my voice ring out crystal clear, completely devoid of any trembling emotion, perfectly flawlessly amplified by the massive high-tech speakers surrounding the entire grand room. I politely formally thanked them all for gathering here tonight in this lavish, expensive setting to aggressively celebrate what my father had just enthusiastically, passionately described as a massive, incredibly historic corporate milestone. I told the breathless, captive audience that my father was actually absolutely correct about one single specific thing. I stated that tonight was indeed completely undeniably historic, but absolutely not for the wildly fabricated reasons he had so proudly, loudly claimed just a few short moments ago. I paused deliberately, letting the immense crushing weight of my perfectly articulated words completely heavily settle over the entirely confused, completely captive audience. I formally confidently introduced myself to the 300 stunned guests, not as the estranged, useless, completely discarded daughter of Richard, but as Harper, the absolute sole founder and chief executive officer of the massive, highly private wealth management firm known globally as Apex Capital. The collective massive gasp that instantly violently rippled through the massive ballroom was incredibly physically palpable. I clearly saw hundreds of highly successful, incredibly ruthless businessmen and women suddenly rapidly lean forward, their eyes widening in absolute sheer, unadulterated shock as their incredibly sharp financial minds desperately, actively tried to immediately reconcile the quiet, heavily dismissed daughter they vaguely barely remembered with the massive, terrifying, anonymous billionaire holding company that was currently entirely dominating their highly exclusive financial news. I kept my voice perfectly, incredibly even, completely brutally ruthless. I told the highly captive, breathless audience that over the past 48 incredibly frantic hours, my father and his supposedly brilliant senior legal counsel, Marcus, had been actively, desperately, secretly negotiating with my heavily shielded proxy attorneys. I calmly, clearly explained that they had been blindly, aggressively begging Apex Capital for a massive, incredibly generous financial lifeline to desperately, magically save their legacy, Midwestern Freight Logistics Company, from an incredibly imminent, catastrophic, total operational default. I gestured completely casually over my shoulder toward my father, who was now physically heavily leaning against the back wooden wall of the stage, desperately visibly trying to keep his trembling legs from collapsing entirely under his own heavy weight. I loudly clearly announced to the entire utterly silent room that Richard had stood proudly, confidently on this very stage just 3 short minutes ago, eagerly raising a crystal glass to deep family loyalty and proudly, loudly boasting that Apex Capital had brilliantly recognized his business acumen and swooped in to miraculously save his dying empire. I looked directly, firmly into the center of the massive crowd and completely effortlessly dropped the absolute massive financial hammer. I stated with absolute, chilling, incredibly precise clarity that Apex Capital was absolutely positively not bailing this failing, miserable company out. I told them, looking directly at the prominent banking executives sitting in the front rows, that there was absolutely zero corporate salvation happening here in this ballroom tonight. I formally aggressively announced that as the newly established sole primary creditor and absolute legal owner of the $4 million highly distressed mezzanine debt, I was officially, immediately, publicly initiating full, incredibly aggressive foreclosure proceedings on absolutely every single tangible working asset permanently tied to this heavily mismanaged, completely fraudulent corporation. I explicitly, deliberately detailed to the completely shocked crowd that effective immediately, I personally held the entirely unencumbered commercial deeds to every single aging industrial warehouse, the absolute binding legal titles to the entire 50-truck heavy diesel freight fleet, and the primary underlying residential deed to my father's highly lavish, exclusive suburban family home. The incredibly heavy silence in the massive room violently, suddenly shattered into a million sharp pieces. Incredibly loud, frantic, panicked murmurs instantly erupted across the 30 perfectly beautifully arranged tables. I actively saw several senior regional bank managers immediately rapidly pulling out their expensive cell phones, their faces turning stark pale with sudden, sheer, undeniable professional panic. I watched highly connected local politicians quickly, discreetly, physically stepping away from the prominent front tables, desperately, rapidly trying to instantly, legally distance themselves from a massive, highly toxic, imploding corporate disaster. I raised my hand firmly, clearly calling for immediate silence, and the sheer, absolute, commanding authority in my rigid posture made the massive, chaotic room instantly, terrifyingly quiet down once again. I leaned incredibly closely into the microphone and told the deeply captivated crowd that I did not execute this highly aggressive, incredibly hostile corporate takeover, simply because this logistics company was heavily failing. I calmly stated that normal businesses unfortunately fail every single day due to poor strategic management, incredibly outdated legacy systems, and incredibly stubborn, arrogant, unyielding leadership. I loudly, completely announced that I executed this massive, highly public, completely ruthless financial kill shot, specifically because this particular corporate failure was built entirely, completely on a dark, hidden foundation of massive, deeply malicious, highly illegal financial fraud. I turned slightly to my right and gave Thomas a sharp, incredibly precise, prearranged nod. Thomas smoothly, confidently opened his heavy, locking, protective leather briefcase and carefully extracted a sleek, incredibly small, silver secure flash drive. He walked quickly, professionally over to the deeply panicked, sweating audio-visual technician who was sitting completely frozen at the side stage digital control board. Thomas absolutely did not ask for any technical assistance or polite permission. He simply aggressively reached over and directly plugged the secure drive directly into the primary presentation laptop, immediately bypassing their systems and quickly executing a single, highly specific command. The massive, incredibly bright, high-definition presentation screens, completely spanning the entire massive back wall of the grand ballroom, suddenly violently, brightly flickered to life. The massive glowing screens absolutely did not display the proud, aging legacy logo of my father's Midwestern Freight Company, or the lavish, highly expensive promotional marketing videos they had proudly planned to eagerly show their wealthy investors. Instead, the massive screens projected an incredibly massive, incredibly clear, highly magnified, ultra-high-resolution scanned image of a highly complex, extremely dense commercial underwriting financial agreement. It was the exact, incredibly toxic, deeply fraudulent $4 million mezzanine loan legal document originating from exactly 5 years ago. The massive, dense legal text loomed heavily, ominously over the entire absolutely silent crowd, like a towering, glowing digital monument entirely dedicated to their absolute, total, undeniable destruction. I directly, firmly instructed the completely, heavily captivated audience to look incredibly closely at the massive glowing screens positioned right behind my head. I clearly, perfectly explained exactly, precisely, how exactly, 5 years ago, when this aging, supposedly proud legacy freight company was already secretly, actively, heavily bleeding liquid cash and facing total, absolute, terrifying ruin. My father and his highly respected, completely trusted son-in-law deeply, desperately needed a massive, rapid cash injection to completely maintain their completely fake, lavish, luxurious daily lifestyle. I clearly detailed how they were entirely, completely out of any viable legal financial options, so they simply arrogantly, maliciously decided to completely manufacture a completely, incredibly illegal one. I walked slowly, confidently across the wide, elevated stage, my voice echoing loudly, perfectly outlining exactly, precisely how they had secretly, cowardly taken the early, absolutely pristine corporate incorporation papers of my completely, entirely independent, highly successful, debt-free technology software startup, and deeply, maliciously, completely weaponized my entirely clean, flawless financial identity. Thomas confidently tapped a specific key on the presentation laptop, and the massive glowing digital projection behind me instantly, seamlessly, completely shifted rapidly. zooming in incredibly tightly on the final legally binding execution page of the deeply fraudulent, highly illegal commercial contract. The massive projected image was incredibly totally sharp, perfectly highlighting absolutely every single sweeping curve of the dark black ink. I turned and pointed directly entirely at the primary legally binding signature line heavily featured on the screen. I loudly, incredibly firmly stated directly to the 300 deeply horrified, perfectly dressed guests that the specific signature currently massively displayed on that towering screen, supposedly completely legally binding me to $4 million entire dollars of incredibly toxic failing corporate debt, was a complete, absolute, meticulously, incredibly, maliciously crafted total forgery. I clearly loudly told them I had absolutely never seen that massive document, never once authorized that massive fraudulent loan, and had absolutely never received a single tiny solitary penny of those massively stolen illicit funds. The entire massive wealthy crowd was completely, entirely, breathtakingly breathless. I could actually physically clearly see incredibly prominent, powerful downtown corporate attorneys sitting in the expensive front rows, completely staring completely up at the glowing massive screen with absolute sheer, unadulterated professional horror completely gripping their faces. But I was absolutely, entirely not finished yet. The ultimate, absolute, totally devastating destruction was perfectly heavily reserved, specifically directly for the exact, incredibly arrogant man who had just desperately tried to physically, aggressively, completely intimidate me in the center marble aisle. Thomas smoothly tapped the laptop keyboard one final devastating time, and the massive digital projection completely immediately shifted again, heavily zooming in incredibly, incredibly tightly on the absolute extreme bottom right corner of the deeply fraudulent illegal document, resting exactly right immediately beside my completely heavily forged personal signature. The massive, incredibly high-definition glowing screen, perfectly intensely brightly illuminated and incredibly highly detailed, totally official, actively registered state legal notary seal. It was the absolute, highly legally binding, completely necessary authentication stamp, entirely required to completely federally legitimize the massive corporate fraudulent loan. I turned my head and stared completely directly out at the deeply silent crowd, easily quickly finding Marcus exactly precisely where he was still standing, completely, entirely frozen, utterly, completely paralyzed, right in the middle of the expensive center marble aisle. I spoke completely directly, entirely into the hot microphone, my steady voice ringing with total, absolute, incredibly devastating finality that completely filled the entire grand room. I heavily instructed the entire silent room to look incredibly, incredibly closely directly at that massive, glowing, official state notary seal. I loudly formally announced that the massive, completely illegal, $4 million entire dollar corporate loan entirely secured by blatant federal wire fraud and incredibly blatant, totally malicious, complete identity theft was formally, perfectly, legally, aggressively authenticated directly by the highly respected senior legal counsel of this very Midwestern logistics company. I clearly, perfectly, aggressively read the exact specific name printed completely, boldly, entirely inside the massive, heavily projected dark notary stamp, totally echoing it incredibly loudly, powerfully across the deeply opulent, utterly silent ballroom for absolutely every single powerful judge, local politician, and senior corporate partner in the entire room to clearly, undeniably, fully hear. I loudly, perfectly announced the exact specific name Marcus, and clearly, accurately stated exactly, completely, how he had highly aggressively, illegally used his deeply sworn, incredibly powerful, trusted position as a formal legal officer of the court to intentionally, actively, maliciously, incredibly, entirely facilitate a massive federal legal felony against his very own innocent family member, simply, absolutely, purely to completely fund his sprawling gated suburban mansion and his matching imported luxury cars. The entire incredibly lavish grand ballroom completely, instantly, absolutely, entirely exploded into total, sheer, absolute, incredibly massive, chaotic, deafening chaos. The sheer magnitude of the absolute chaos that erupted in that grand hotel ballroom was a symphony of perfectly orchestrated destruction. The deafening roar of 300 wealthy Chicago elites collectively gasping and murmuring in pure, unadulterated shock echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. I stood completely still on the elevated stage, holding the microphone with a perfectly steady hand, watching the devastating shockwave violently tear through the room. My eyes remained completely locked on Marcus, the brilliant, incredibly arrogant corporate attorney who had built his entire identity on projecting absolute flawless superiority was completely malfunctioning. His mouth opened and closed in rapid succession, but his vocal cords utterly failed him. The heavy legal and financial reality of what I had just publicly revealed was violently crashing down upon him, completely crushing his spirit and his future into fine dust. But the absolute true consequence of his massive legal felony did not come from me. It came directly from the very front row. Sitting at the absolute center table, perfectly positioned to witness this entire disaster, was a man named Arthur Sterling. He was the incredibly powerful, deeply feared senior managing partner of the prestigious downtown law firm where Marcus had just arrogantly boasted he was about to make partner. Arthur Sterling was an old-school cutthroat litigator who protected his firm and its pristine legal reputation with absolute vicious ruthlessness. As the massive projected image of Marcus' forged notary stamp continued to glow brightly behind me, I actively watched the blood rush violently into Mr. Sterling's face. His skin turned a deep, terrifying shade of crimson. He suddenly forcefully pushed his heavy chair back, sending it completely scraping across the polished marble floor. Mr. Sterling shot to his feet, his massive frame shaking with an intensity of pure, unadulterated fury that completely commanded the attention of the surrounding tables. He did not care about the social setting or the polite etiquette of the corporate gala. He only cared about immediately completely severing his incredibly prestigious law firm from a massive, toxic federal wire fraud scandal. He pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at Marcus, who was still standing completely frozen in the center aisle. Mr. Sterling's voice boomed across the incredibly crowded room, completely slicing through the chaotic murmurs with absolute terrifying legal precision. He aggressively shouted directly at Marcus, demanding to know if he had actually illegally used his official sworn state notary seal to actively facilitate a massive fraudulent commercial loan. Marcus physically flinched violently, stepping back as if he had just been physically struck. He desperately raised his hands, stammering out incomplete, panicked syllables, begging his senior partner to please wait and let him explain the highly complex situation. But Mr. Sterling absolutely refused to hear a single pathetic excuse. He stepped aggressively toward the edge of the aisle, his voice rising in volume and intense, absolute disgust. He loudly, publicly informed Marcus that he was a complete disgrace to the entire legal profession. Mr. Sterling aggressively announced to the entire ballroom that his law firm absolutely, entirely, completely disavowed any knowledge of this massive criminal enterprise. He stared incredibly coldly at the sweating, terrified man who had just expected a massive promotion and delivered the absolute final, fatal blow. He firmly, formally, loudly declared that Marcus was completely, immediately fired, terminated effectively right this exact second. He promised Marcus that he would personally ensure the State Bar Association permanently, violently revoked his legal license before the sun came up tomorrow, and that he would happily hand over every single piece of internal documentation to the federal authorities. Marcus physically collapsed inward. His broad shoulders violently slumped, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow, terrified breaths. The shiny imported luxury cars, the sprawling gated suburban mansion, the wealthy elite country club lifestyle, all of it officially, instantly died right there on the incredibly expensive marble floor. He had completely sacrificed his entire professional existence and his freedom just to fund a fake life, and now he was absolutely nothing but a disgraced, unemployed felon facing mandatory federal prison time. I slowly turned my completely, entirely unyielding gaze away from the broken, sobbing attorney in the aisle and directed my absolute full attention back to the man standing right beside me on the illuminated stage. My father, Richard, was physically swaying. He looked incredibly, heavily, deeply aged, as if 30 years of arrogant pride had been instantly, violently stripped from his bones in a matter of seconds. His perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo hung awkwardly on his trembling frame. He slowly, weakly raised his head to look at me. The deep, blinding anger that usually lived permanently in his dark eyes was completely, entirely gone. It was totally replaced by a hollow, staggering, utterly terrifying realization. He stared at my custom-tailored charcoal gray designer suit. He looked at the massive, incredibly confident corporate security operatives standing perfectly still around the perimeter. He looked at Thomas, my incredibly sharp, brilliant lead attorney, standing dutifully behind my shoulder. And then he looked incredibly deeply into my completely cold, unyielding eyes. His lips trembled violently as the massive, crushing weight of his absolute fatal mistake completely settled over his mind. He opened his mouth and weakly, terribly, hoarsely whispered a single, complete realization directly to me. He asked it incredibly quietly, his voice completely breaking if it was truly me. He asked if I was actually Apex Capital. I absolutely did not whisper my final response. I did not want this to be a private, intimate family moment. I wanted his absolute, complete, total devastation to be broadcast to the entire room. I slowly, deliberately, confidently leaned my face incredibly closely, directly into the hot microphone, holding his terrified, shattered gaze with absolute, pure, unbroken intensity. My voice echoed loudly, sharply, perfectly flawlessly across the massive, silent, completely paralyzed ballroom. I calmly, perfectly, completely reminded him of the exact specific words he had aggressively screamed at me on his covered porch in the pouring, freezing rain just 5 short days ago. I loudly told the entire captive audience exactly how he had violently, forcefully ordered me to get out of his house because I was nothing but a useless, sick daughter who had completely failed to contribute to his precious family legacy. I watched the absolute, sheer, unadulterated horror actively, completely wash over his pale, incredibly sweating face as he finally recognized the total, absolute power I now completely, legally possessed. I leaned in even closer, my voice completely devoid of any trembling emotion, delivering the absolute, fatal, unyielding truth. I told him incredibly loudly, incredibly clearly that he had told me to get out of his house. And now I was officially, legally telling him to get out of mine. I heavily, perfectly, accurately announced to him and to the entire, utterly, completely breathless crowd that I legally, actively, absolutely owned the entire primary residential deed. My father let out a strange, choked, completely broken gasp. His knees violently buckled, and he aggressively reached out a heavy, shaking hand to grip the thin metal microphone stand, just to keep himself from completely, physically collapsing directly onto the plush stage carpet. Down below in the front row, Jessica finally completely broke. She let out a loud, massive, deeply pathetic wail, burying her face entirely in her hands as the absolute reality of her impending, immediate poverty and her husband's impending prison sentence completely, entirely, completely broke her fragile, fake reality. They had blindly, confidently assumed I was just a naive, struggling computer programmer they could easily use to perfectly clean up their dirty, incredibly illegal, massive financial messes. They had absolutely no idea that I was the exact predator who would ultimately, violently, entirely burn their entire corrupt kingdom straight to the absolute ground. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel completely emptied in a matter of minutes. It was a massive, sudden exodus of the incredibly wealthy and powerful, desperately fleeing a rapidly sinking ship. The exact moment Arthur Sterling publicly fired Marcus and my father physically collapsed against the stage, the elite guests instinctively knew the lavish party was entirely over. They did not calmly walk toward the beautiful exit doors. They practically sprinted. Local politicians suddenly mysteriously remembered urgent late-night meetings. Prominent corporate partners grabbed their expensive coats and vanished completely into the cold, wet Chicago night, absolutely refusing to look back. Nobody in that room wanted to be caught standing anywhere near a massive, highly toxic federal fraud scandal. The elegant string quartet had completely stopped playing long ago, hastily, frantically packing their expensive instruments and slipping out through the swinging kitchen doors. Within exactly 10 minutes, the incredibly lavish $100,000 corporate gala was violently reduced to a vast, incredibly empty room, filled only with abandoned champagne flutes and totally untouched, expensive beluga caviar. My father remained heavily slumped on the plush carpeted stage, staring blankly at the massive, glowing presentation screens that still boldly displayed his absolute total ruin. Marcus was still standing, completely paralyzed in the main center aisle, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he desperately tried to dial useless numbers on his phone. Jessica was sobbing loudly, incredibly pathetically, near the massive floral centerpieces, her perfect emerald designer gown, totally ruined and heavily stained with spilled wine. They were completely, entirely isolated in the massive, opulent space. They incorrectly thought the absolute worst part of their entire night was my highly public financial announcement. They had absolutely no idea that my brilliant legal team had already explicitly set the second devastating phase of their total destruction into aggressive motion many hours ago. Thomas had perfectly explicitly coordinated directly with federal investigators, completely timing the formal delivery of our massive digital evidence dossier with the exact scheduled start of their ridiculous vain celebration. I did not even have to lift a single finger to physically summon the proper authorities. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom suddenly violently swung open once again, but it was absolutely not late arriving wealthy guests. It was a highly organized, incredibly intimidating team of federal agents and local Chicago police officers. They marched purposefully into the dead silent room with absolute, unquestionable legal authority, wearing dark windbreakers with thick, bold yellow lettering prominently displayed across their backs. The lead federal investigator, a tall, incredibly stern woman, walked directly purposely past the shattered champagne glasses and handed my terrified father a massive, incredibly thick stack of federal warrants. She loudly, formally announced that they were immediately actively seizing all corporate servers, all personal electronic devices, and every single piece of financial documentation permanently connected to his Midwestern freight logistics company. My father did not even try to physically argue or raise his booming voice. He just sat there looking completely, entirely hollowed out as federal agents began aggressively unplugging his personal cell phone from the wall charger and rapidly tagging it for criminal evidence. Marcus finally completely snapped out of his utterly paralyzed state. His massive, deeply fragile legal ego suddenly flared up for one final, incredibly pathetic attempt at arrogant survival. He aggressively stepped directly in front of the lead federal agent, loudly, violently demanding to specifically see the executed warrants, and pompously, loudly claiming that as senior legal counsel, he had the absolute, undeniable right to formally review the exact probable cause. The lead federal investigator simply looked at him with absolute, pure, unadulterated, professional disgust. She calmly, incredibly, coldly informed him that he was absolutely no longer acting as legal counsel for anyone in this room or anywhere else. She pulled out a separate, incredibly thick legal folder and loudly, clearly read him his Miranda rights. They had the heavily forged notary stamps, the completely fraudulent commercial loan documents, and the exact digital wire transfer receipts, clearly showing exactly how he had aggressively, maliciously funneled $4 million stolen dollars directly into his own private secret trust accounts. She explicitly clearly told him he was being formally heavily charged with massive federal wire fraud, severe malicious identity theft, and completely egregious absolute legal malpractice. The incredibly arrogant, highly polished corporate attorney who had spent his entire adult life desperately, aggressively projecting absolute legal superiority, was roughly physically spun around and forcefully placed in heavy, cold steel handcuffs right in the middle of the incredibly expensive hotel carpet. I stood perfectly, absolutely still near the stage doors, quietly, peacefully watching the brutal, unforgiving reality of the justice system completely, entirely swallow him whole. There was absolutely no last-minute bargaining, and absolutely no clever legal loophole he could aggressively, creatively exploit. By using his official sworn state notary seal to actively directly authenticate a massive blatant felony against his very own innocent family member, he had completely committed the ultimate, absolute legal sin. The State Bar Association was already actively immediately processing his permanent, total disbarment. He would absolutely never step foot inside a prestigious courtroom again, unless he was physically wearing a bright orange federal prison jumpsuit. He would be facing incredibly long, miserable decades behind heavy federal bars. His entire perfectly curated, incredibly arrogant, fake existence was completely permanently eradicated in the absolute blink of an eye. I silently watched the grim police officers physically, aggressively march him out through the beautiful grand lobby, his highly expensive, custom-tailored suit completely, terribly rumpled, his head hanging incredibly heavily low in total, absolute, devastating public disgrace. The complete, absolute destruction of their fake, luxurious lifestyle happened with breathtaking, incredibly terrifying speed. While the federal authorities were actively, aggressively arresting Marcus in the hotel ballroom, another highly coordinated team of federal investigators was simultaneously rapidly arriving at their sprawling gated suburban mansion. Because they had actively, maliciously used the massively stolen funds to completely heavily finance their incredibly lavish daily existence, absolutely everything they legally owned was instantly officially considered direct illicit proceeds of a major federal crime. The incredibly massive total financial freeze was entirely, completely, absolute, and instantaneous. Their joint private bank accounts were completely, totally locked by the federal government. Their pristine, exclusive platinum credit cards were immediately, aggressively, permanently deactivated. Jessica, who had spent the last incredibly toxic decade entirely, completely believing she was absolute, unquestionable, untouchable royalty, suddenly possessed absolutely, positively nothing but the stained wet designer dress currently heavily hanging on her shaking back. The incredibly satisfying absolute climax of her total, absolute ruin happened just shortly before midnight. Jessica had frantically, desperately ordered a luxury car service to quickly drive her back to her massive, sprawling suburban estate, completely, desperately, frantically hoping to quietly hide inside her giant, expensive safe house. But when the hired black town car pulled up to the massive custom wrought iron security gates, she was completely, aggressively, entirely locked out. The federal authorities had already officially legally seized the massive physical property, entirely completely changing the main security codes and placing heavy, bright yellow federal warning tape heavily across the custom-carved mahogany front doors. I stood quietly, peacefully on the dark, wet street corner, entirely safely, securely surrounded by my loyal private security detail, completely watching the absolute most glorious, chaotic, incredible scene unfold. Two massive, heavy-duty commercial tow trucks were actively, aggressively, loudly backing directly into her pristine, beautiful, heated driveway. Jessica stood violently shivering in the incredibly cold October wind, completely, heavily sobbing uncontrollably as the aggressive, focused repo men quickly, incredibly professionally hooked up her matching, highly imported luxury SUVs. Those were the exact same incredibly expensive, beautiful vehicles she had constantly, proudly, arrogantly paraded all over her incredibly shallow social media feeds, completely, loudly, happily bragging about her incredibly wealthy, highly successful husband. Now those incredibly shiny, heavy metal status symbols were being violently, roughly, aggressively dragged away, completely under the harsh, glaring, bright orange lights of the massive tow trucks. She wildly, desperately, frantically screamed at the completely indifferent workers, frantically waving her thin arms and loudly crying out that they were actively making a massive, terrible, illegal mistake. She aggressively, furiously demanded that they immediately stop loudly, completely aggressively, claiming she was a highly prominent, wealthy local socialite who would absolutely, completely, successfully sue them all into total, absolute oblivion. The focused repo men did not even bother to quickly look at her. They just quietly continued working with absolute cold, efficient mechanical precision, completely, totally, actively ignoring her deeply, incredibly pathetic, desperate screaming temper tantrum. She was finally completely, violently, entirely stripped of the massive, incredibly toxic illusion she had spent her entire deeply pathetic life aggressively, happily building. The incredibly spoiled golden child was entirely, completely, absolutely, totally broke. She had absolutely no high-paying, prestigious career, no legitimate, incredibly wealthy husband, and absolutely no massive, comfortable safety net to magically, easily catch her. The arrogant father she had always completely, aggressively, happily manipulated was currently actively facing his own incredibly massive federal indictment and total, absolute, humiliating financial bankruptcy. The incredibly luxurious, perfectly pristine world she had maliciously built, entirely using my massively stolen identity, had completely, entirely, thoroughly vanished in a matter of incredibly short hours. I quietly, peacefully turned around and smoothly, confidently stepped back into my incredibly warm, highly secure armored vehicle, leaving her completely, entirely, totally alone, sobbing wildly, aggressively in the freezing dark rain. Exactly 14 days after the grand gala, the dust had finally entirely settled over the absolute total wreckage of my parents' former lives. I was sitting comfortably in my massive corner office at the global headquarters of Apex Capital, quietly reviewing a highly profitable quarterly report when my private secure line began to blink. It was David, my incredibly loyal head of security, permanently stationed in the main lobby 50 stories below. His voice was perfectly level and completely professional, as he quickly informed me that 2 unauthorized visitors were currently standing at the front security turnstiles, actively, loudly demanding to speak directly with the chief executive officer. I did not even need to ask for their specific names. I knew exactly who had finally completely run out of options and who was desperate enough to show up entirely uninvited. I stood up slowly, smoothing the sharp, perfectly tailored lines of my charcoal designer suit, and walked deliberately out to my private executive glass elevator. The quiet, incredibly smooth hum of the elevator descending 50 floors gave me exactly 2 pure, uninterrupted minutes to completely center my mind. I was absolutely, positively not going to let them see a single tiny trace of the terrified 13-year-old girl they had violently thrown out into the freezing, pouring rain all those years ago. I stepped out into the massive, soaring marble lobby of the Apex Capital Global building. The immense space was specifically designed to be incredibly intimidating, featuring towering white marble columns, highly polished dark granite floors, and a massive, magnificent wall of continuously cascading water. Standing right in the absolute direct center of all that cold, magnificent corporate power were Richard and Patricia Myers. They looked incredibly, remarkably small. My father, Richard, a man who had proudly spent his entire life aggressively taking up as much physical and emotional space as possible, was visibly completely hunched over. The expensive, custom-tailored suits he always used to proudly heavily wear had been entirely replaced by a highly wrinkled, incredibly generic gray jacket that hung loosely on his rapidly shrinking frame. The arrogant, booming voice that had constantly aggressively terrorized our household was completely, entirely gone. Beside him, my mother, Patricia, nervously clutched a highly worn leather handbag, her thin shoulders trembling violently. The heavy, expensive makeup she always expertly used to hide her incredibly shallow soul was completely, utterly ruined by thick, wet, continuous tracks of actual, genuine tears. 2 massive, highly trained corporate security guards stood firmly actively between my parents and the secure glass turnstiles, physically completely blocking their desperate, pathetic path. I walked slowly and highly deliberately across the wide-open, expansive lobby floor. The sharp, rhythmic, aggressive clicking of my heels, echoing loudly off the polished marble, instantly made them both snap their heads up. Patricia let out a loud, incredibly pathetic, broken sob the absolute exact second she finally made direct eye contact with me. She desperately, wildly reached her shaking hands out toward me completely, entirely ignoring the massive security guard, who quickly, smoothly stepped forward to firmly block her path. My father swallowed incredibly hard, his dry throat bobbing nervously. He looked directly at my expensive designer suit. He looked around at the massive corporate headquarters I completely, absolutely owned, and his deeply, heavily fragile ego finally, entirely, completely shattered into a million tiny, invisible pieces. He stepped forward, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic, incredibly desperate whine. He quietly, miserably told me they had absolutely nothing left in the entire world. He aggressively, desperately explained that the federal investigators had permanently seized their joint bank accounts, completely frozen their retirement funds, and officially heavily evicted them from the beautiful suburban mansion I now entirely legally owned. He frantically, heavily pleaded with me, actively, loudly crying that they were currently terribly sleeping on a highly uncomfortable pull-out couch in an incredibly cheap, dirty roadside motel. Patricia completely, utterly broke down, entirely, heavily sobbing into her shaking hands, loudly crying out my name, begging desperately for a tiny sliver of absolute mercy. She wildly, aggressively cried that she was my mother, completely insisting that a daughter could absolutely never, ever completely abandon the devoted woman who generously gave her life. Richard quickly, aggressively nodded, latching entirely onto her pathetic, toxic, emotional manipulation. He desperately, heavily begged for a tiny single financial handout. He rapidly, frantically, quickly promised they would entirely, quietly, peacefully move away to a completely different state and absolutely never, ever bother my perfect, incredibly successful life again if I would just generously, kindly write them one single, tiny, completely insignificant check. He looked directly, deeply into my cold, unyielding eyes and terribly whispered the exact, incredibly toxic, deeply manipulative phrase they had aggressively used to violently control me my entire miserable childhood. He pathetically, actively told me that we were absolute, pure blood. He frantically, heavily told me we were a deeply bound, permanent family, and desperately, intensely begged me to remember that I had so much immense, incredible wealth, while they currently had absolutely nothing. I stood perfectly, physically, completely still, just quietly, peacefully, incredibly calmly, observing the two deeply, totally broken people, standing miserably, directly before me. I felt absolutely zero pity. I felt absolutely, positively no crippling, devastating sadness. I felt absolutely nothing but a deep, incredibly pure, completely quiet, absolute internal peace. I looked directly, entirely into my father's desperate, incredibly panicked red-rimmed eyes, and I slowly let my calm, perfectly level, entirely steady voice completely fill the massive, quiet marble lobby. I quietly, calmly, perfectly reminded them of a highly specific, freezing, stormy October night precisely exactly 15 years ago. I clearly, vividly, heavily described exactly perfectly how I had desperately, intensely, violently pleaded with them, crying violently, sobbing uncontrollably, begging them to simply please, truly look at the massive, obvious, incredibly undeniable truth. I smoothly, coldly, incredibly, ruthlessly reminded them exactly how they had happily, easily, comfortably, entirely chosen a highly malicious, totally fabricated lie over their very own incredibly innocent, desperate, terrified, lonely teenage daughter. I absolutely, calmly, explicitly, clearly told them that true, genuine family does not ever maliciously, violently, intentionally, eagerly, actively, officially forge highly complex, binding legal corporate signatures to completely, successfully, entirely, financially ruin their own deeply innocent, trusting, incredibly naive children. I took one single, highly powerful, absolutely dominating step forward, perfectly, actively invading their immediate physical space. I told them loudly, explicitly, incredibly clearly that they had absolutely, perfectly, carefully, permanently, entirely made their ultimate, deeply toxic, incredibly malicious, completely irreversible, absolute final choice. I brutally, coldly, completely told them that they had actively, happily, enthusiastically, entirely invested absolutely every single drop of their highly conditional, pathetic parental love directly, entirely, heavily into Jessica. I calmly, ruthlessly, heavily told them to physically, immediately turn around, completely, violently, entirely leave my magnificent, incredibly expensive, private, massive global corporate building, right? This exact absolute second, and go directly, frantically, aggressively, heavily ask their highly successful, perfectly flawless, incredibly beautiful, amazing, absolutely golden child for a massive, incredibly generous total financial bailout. I did not wait for a single, tearful, completely desperate, frantic, pathetic reply. I did not waste another single fleeting, entirely precious second of my incredibly successful, perfect, beautiful, absolute life looking at their completely, utterly, totally ruined, absolute toxic, thoroughly destroyed faces. I simply quietly, gracefully turned my head and gave my massive, incredible, professional, highly trained, strictly, deeply loyal head of security one single, completely sharp, perfectly, incredibly explicit, tiny, absolute final nod. The two incredibly large, highly capable, completely trained professional corporate guards immediately, heavily, efficiently, precisely, seamlessly, forcefully, yet absolutely flawlessly, professionally, physically, actively moved forward. I smoothly, confidently, completely, elegantly, entirely turned around and walked directly, perfectly, beautifully, entirely smoothly back toward my completely, heavily exclusive, entirely private, incredibly, totally secure, beautiful glass elevator. I absolutely never looked back. I did not hear the massive, clear, stunning, heavy glass doors, heavily, perfectly close, entirely smoothly, absolutely firmly, exactly behind them. I just stepped directly, perfectly easily into the absolutely quiet, entirely, completely pristine, flawless, beautiful, completely illuminated elevator, ascending utterly, immediately, completely peacefully, directly back up into the perfectly pure, incredibly absolute, incredibly total, completely brilliant light. It took exactly 6 months to completely systematically dismantle my father's entire legacy. His empire had been built entirely on a deeply fragile foundation of aggressive ego, and it was ultimately completely sustained by desperate, malicious fraud. I absolutely did not keep a single heavy diesel truck. I did not keep a single sprawling industrial warehouse. My elite legal team and highly aggressive financial advisors moved with absolute ruthless cold efficiency. We completely liquidated the entire Midwestern freight company piece by piece, breaking it down into basic raw capital. The massive, loud diesel trucks that my father used to proudly, violently parade around the city were quickly auctioned off to the absolute highest bidders. The incredibly massive industrial warehouses were rapidly sold to modern, highly efficient logistics firms that actually truly understood how to run a profitable business completely legally. Every single tangible physical asset that carried the heavy toxic weight of my family's deep corruption was entirely officially converted into clean liquid funds. I sat in my quiet office and watched the massive numbers heavily hit my holding company's private accounts, and I felt absolutely no sentimental attachment whatsoever. That money was inherently completely dirty. It was heavily permanently stained with years of toxic deceit and the aggressive, malicious theft of my own innocent identity. I knew exactly what I needed to do to finally wash it completely, beautifully clean. I immediately established a massive, permanent private endowment fund, specifically explicitly designed to completely support young, underprivileged girls who desperately wanted to pursue advanced degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I poured every single massive dollar from the total liquidation of my father's corrupt empire directly, entirely into that foundation. I wanted to actively, permanently ensure that the immense wealth they tried to illegally use to completely destroy a young female software developer would instead be used to aggressively create thousands more brilliant minds exactly like me. It was the absolute, ultimate, beautiful, poetic justice. Every single time a young, brilliant girl receives a massive scholarship to build her own incredible future, my father's incredibly toxic legacy is actively, beautifully, permanently erased from the world. Today I'm sitting quietly in the incredibly expansive, deeply serene living room of my downtown luxury penthouse. The massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows offer an absolutely breathtaking, sweeping, panoramic view of the entire Chicago skyline. The bright, beautiful city lights constantly glitter far below me, looking exactly like a magnificent, endless sea of diamonds, completely scattered against the dark, peaceful night sky. The cool air in my beautiful home is perfectly, incredibly still, completely, profoundly peaceful, and entirely solely my own. There is absolutely no loud, aggressive screaming. There is no constant, toxic belittling. There is absolutely no one arrogantly, violently demanding that I quietly shrink my own existence just to actively make their fragile egos feel temporarily bigger. I hold a warm, comforting cup of expensive coffee and just quietly watch the busy city move, feeling a truly profound sense of sheer, unadulterated, total freedom. People often cautiously, nervously ask me if I feel any deep, lingering guilt about what exactly happened to my biological family. Society always places such a heavy, terrifying, incredibly unfair burden on daughters to endlessly, blindly forgive and constantly heavily support their toxic families, no matter how much severe emotional abuse they actively suffer. But looking out over the glowing, beautiful city tonight, I can completely honestly say I feel absolutely zero guilt. I carry absolutely no heavy, dark emotional baggage from that deeply painful chapter of my life. For so many long, lonely years, I genuinely thought I was the actual core problem. I thought my incredibly quiet nature and my deep, passionate love for coding and logic naturally made me inherently unlovable to the very people who were absolutely supposed to fiercely protect me. I spent my entire sad childhood desperately, exhaustingly trying to completely earn a tiny, insignificant seat at a family table where the game was always completely, violently rigged, entirely against me. But standing on that bright gala stage, I finally entirely realized that actively, aggressively setting firm boundaries is absolutely not an act of malicious revenge. It is a pure, simple, beautiful act of total personal survival. I absolutely did not actively destroy my incredibly toxic family. Their own incredibly blinding arrogance and deep, malicious criminal greed completely entirely did that perfectly well, entirely on their own. I simply quietly, strongly refused to be their silent, convenient collateral damage for even one more single second. I deliberately, sharply severed the deeply infected, highly toxic branch of my family tree. It was an incredibly painful, sharp cut, but it was absolutely, totally, incredibly necessary. And purely because I finally had the absolute sheer courage to make that decisive, permanent cut, the rest of my beautiful, incredible tree finally had the bright, clear space and the warm, healthy sunlight to beautifully, wildly, completely bloom. If you are watching this video right now and you deeply, intimately recognize your own painful, silent struggles within my story, I genuinely, deeply want you to hear this specific message incredibly loud and perfectly clear. Your absolute, true, inherent worth is not ever determined by the deeply flawed, toxic people who continually blindly fail to see it. You absolutely do not owe your fierce, beautiful loyalty to manipulative people who only view you as a convenient, disposable tool to aggressively exploit for their own selfish, greedy gain. You have every single absolute, undeniable right to confidently, completely walk away from highly toxic, draining environments, even if those dark environments are filled completely with people who heavily share your exact blood. You have the absolute total right to independently, boldly build your own incredible, magnificent empire, completely, entirely on your own terms. Do not ever let any arrogant, miserable person falsely tell you that you are too small or too insignificant to fiercely, successfully fight back. You forever completely hold the powerful pen to your own beautiful, incredible story. Thank you so much for staying completely with me through this entire incredibly emotional journey. If this deeply personal story resonated entirely with your heart and gave you the bright, fierce courage to finally set your own incredibly healthy boundaries, please take one quick second to hit that like button and actively subscribe to the channel. It really, truly actively helps these important stories quickly reach the incredible people who deeply, desperately need to hear them today. I absolutely love actively connecting with you all, so please drop a quick comment below right now and let me know exactly where you are watching from and what exact time it is there right now. Remember, you are incredibly powerful, you are deeply, completely worthy, and you entirely, absolutely deserve your own beautiful, peaceful, incredibly brilliant penthouse view. Take care of your beautiful selves until next time. Looking back at the complete dismantling of my parents' fake empire, I realized that the absolute hardest part of this entire journey was not outsmarting them in a corporate boardroom or watching the federal agents seize their physical assets. The absolute hardest part was actively unlearning the incredibly toxic lies I had been forcefully fed since the exact day I was born. When you grow up inside a deeply dysfunctional, incredibly abusive family dynamic, you do not realize how completely warped your daily reality has become, because absolute terrifying chaos simply quietly becomes your normal, everyday baseline. In psychology, there is a very specific professional term for exactly what I deeply, painfully experienced. It is deeply known as being the family scapegoat. The scapegoat is the one specific person deliberately, systematically, maliciously chosen to carry the entire heavy burden of the family dysfunction so the precious, protected golden child can safely remain perfectly flawless and completely unquestioned. Whenever absolutely anything went wrong in my parents' miserable, failing lives, I was automatically the incredibly convenient target for all of their deeply misplaced rage and bitter disappointment. They systematically, brutally, psychologically conditioned me to deeply internally believe that my core fundamental worth was entirely dependent on my quiet, absolute obedience and my endless, tragic willingness to be constantly treated like an absolute burden. But what they actively did to me went so incredibly far beyond just simple, everyday emotional cruelty or casual parental neglect. It was absolute, undeniable textbook financial abuse disguised incredibly poorly as mandatory family loyalty. Financial abuse is absolutely not just about secretly stealing physical cash from a checking account or casually skipping out on a shared bill. It is a highly calculated, malicious, targeted tactic entirely about actively, completely destroying a person's financial independence just to fiercely keep them entirely trapped, dependent, and completely, fundamentally controllable. When my parents secretly, aggressively, actively forged my personal signature to fraudulently secure their massive corporate loans, they were actively, violently weaponizing my perfectly clean identity to completely, illegally, entirely shield their own massive, horrific failures. They loudly, aggressively demanded my absolute, total, unyielding loyalty, while simultaneously completely denying my basic human existence. Society constantly, heavily, wrongly pressures us to endlessly, blindly, repeatedly forgive our parents, simply purely because they gave us physical life. We are told over and over again by well-meaning outsiders that blood is absolutely thicker than water, and that family must absolutely always come first, no matter what terrible, horrific things they actively, intentionally, completely do to us. But I am standing here today to completely, loudly, permanently, completely shatter that incredibly dangerous, manipulative myth. That highly toxic societal belief is specifically intentionally designed to keep deep wounded victims permanently, physically trapped in the exact same dark environments that continuously, repeatedly, absolutely break them. I need you to loudly, clearly, completely hear this exact, undeniable, ultimate truth. Walking completely away from a highly abusive blood relative is absolutely positively never an act of cruel, cold betrayal. It is the absolute ultimate, profound, beautiful act of pure, fierce, complete self-preservation. You absolutely, positively cannot ever magically heal your deep emotional wounds in the exact same highly toxic environment that originally maliciously broke you. You cannot ever truly, permanently find your true, magnificent, brilliant worth while you are constantly, deliberately surrounded by manipulative, empty people who actively, heavily profit from making you feel totally, profoundly worthless. Leaving them standing completely, utterly empty-handed and totally ruined in that cold marble lobby was the single most incredibly painful and utterly necessary defining decision of my entire existence. It was the exact glorious, absolute, beautiful moment I finally, completely, entirely stopped protecting their dark, horrific secrets and fiercely, beautifully started protecting my own peace. I actively, decisively, permanently severed the deeply infected, highly toxic, broken branch of my family tree. And precisely because I did that incredibly hard, painful thing, my own beautiful, brilliant life could finally, beautifully, wildly, completely bloom into exactly what it was always truly meant to be. I know with absolute, undeniable certainty that there are so many of you actively watching this video right now who deeply, intimately, truly understand exactly what I am talking about. If you have ever been unfairly, maliciously, consistently labeled the black sheep of your own family simply purely because you flatly, completely refused to quietly, respectfully accept their completely toxic behavior, this entire story is absolutely, completely dedicated to you. If you have ever had to make the incredibly agonizing, utterly heartbreaking, deeply terrifying decision to completely, permanently, forcefully cut off toxic family members just to fiercely, actively protect your own mental peace and securely build your own bright, beautiful future, I completely, absolutely see you, and I fiercely, totally validate your incredible, incredible, unimaginable, immense strength. It takes massive, undeniable, raw, powerful courage to stand up directly face to face to the very people who raised you and confidently, loudly, unapologetically, proudly say that enough is absolutely, positively, entirely enough. I genuinely want you to truly deeply know that the heavy, lingering, dark guilt you might occasionally painfully feel in the quiet, lonely moments of the deep night is perfectly, completely normal, but it absolutely, positively does not ever mean you made the wrong choice. You are absolutely, entirely, legally allowed to be massively, wildly successful. You are completely, entirely allowed to be incredibly, brilliantly, genuinely, incredibly happy. And you are absolutely, entirely allowed to fiercely, ruthlessly, completely protect the beautiful, peaceful, secure life you have actively built with your own two bare hands. I genuinely, truly want to actively, completely build a powerful, highly supportive, uplifting community right here of strong, incredible, resilient, beautiful people who truly, deeply, intimately understand this incredibly difficult, lonely, painful journey. Please take one quick second to explicitly hit that like button right now to actively, passionately show your massive total support for completely, entirely breaking these deeply toxic generational family cycles once and for all. Subscribe directly to the channel for more true, powerful, incredible stories of pure, undeniable, breathtaking justice, fierce, beautiful personal empowerment, and strong, brilliant women finally, boldly, aggressively taking back their absolute stolen power. Your wonderful, incredible, daily active support truly, actually, genuinely, completely helps these critical, highly important messages quickly, safely, effectively reach the exact people who desperately, desperately, deeply need to hear them today to simply survive. And I genuinely, deeply, truly want to actively hear directly, entirely from you in the comments section below. Let me quickly, incredibly precisely know exactly what beautiful state or specific city you are actively, peacefully watching from right now. And please tell me exactly, precisely what time it is currently there in your wonderful part of the world. I absolutely solemnly promise you, I sit down every single solitary day and I deeply, actively read absolutely every single comment because your personal, incredible, amazing stories and your amazing, powerful presence mean the absolute, entire, complete world to me. We are absolutely positively not alone in this difficult, ongoing, beautiful fight. There is a whole massive, beautiful, highly supportive global community of us right here who have actively, bravely walked straight through the burning, terrifying fire and safely come out so much stronger, so much wiser, and so much more incredibly powerful on the glorious, peaceful other side. Stay incredibly, exceptionally strong. Always. Firmly, absolutely, perfectly. Know your absolute, undeniable, perfect worth, and never, ever for one single fleeting second let anyone anywhere tell you to quietly, respectfully shrink yourself just to softly make their fragile, toxic egos feel temporarily, completely comfortable. You completely, absolutely, entirely deserve the massive, beautiful, peaceful, incredibly brilliant, successful life you are actively, beautifully building. See you in the next amazing story.